Thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. More about them later.
As an adult, I could see the connections that were lost on a child who tends to see the world in snapshots rather than as a sequence. The picture was complete, but I wished I had never seen it at all.
Rarely do you remember one thing in isolation. Each memory is one link in a long chain that makes up who you are. For some, tugging on any link in the chain, no matter how painful that memory may be, will inevitably pull along several comforting recollections. For others, even their most treasured memories are haunted by a background of trauma, and joy is buried so deeply that it's no longer worth the effort to exhume. Pen Pal is the story of someone in just such a place, an unnamed man on a journey to remember the childhood that was hidden from him. Each of its 6 chapters is more agonizing, more disturbing, and more tragic than the last. I'll do my best to guide you through each chapter, pointing out hidden connections and giving my theories as to what the story is about. The pieces are scattered right now, but I hope I can put them together so you'll see this story is a picture of everything that internet horror can aspire to be. Before you and I get started, I want to note a pair of links in the description. One to the Pen Pal novel on Amazon, and one to the original telling on No Sleep. I'm going to be using details from both versions to tell what I feel is the most complete and concise version of the story. Part of what makes this story so compelling is the fact that it's so grounded. Much of its horror comes from the fear of being watched, losing your privacy, and even stalking, all of which are very real dangers. That's why this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Surfshark offers tools to make your time online safer with an extra layer of security between you, the sites you visit, and anyone looking to get your data. I really enjoy going to coffee shops to write for my videos, but public Wi-Fi is, frankly, a security nightmare. With Surfshark, I don't have to worry about that, since my data is encrypted before it ever has a chance to reach bad actors. Features such as multi-hop put multiple layers of security between yourself and anyone looking to steal your data. Another feature, Kill Switch, ensures that if your VPN connection drops for even a moment, the flow of data immediately stops so that you aren't accidentally exposed online. If that wasn't enough, you can even change your virtual location to access websites and streaming catalogs not available in your home country. If you're in the US like me, you can't watch Late Night with the Devil on Netflix. However, you can just switch your virtual location to New Zealand and get right into the horror. So, if all that sounds good to you, you can use my link in the description to get 4 extra months of Surfshark at an unbeatable price. If you try it and decide that it isn't for you, they offer a 30-day money-back guarantee so that there's no risk whatsoever. With that, thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video, and let's get into Chapter 1 of this deeply traumatizing story.
In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a 6-year-old boy, the muffled rhythmic beats sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor.
Pen Pal opens with a memory that emphasizes an idea that is critical to understanding the story. The mind of a child can supply color to otherwise ordinary experiences. Something as common as the sound of your own heartbeat becomes dangerous when filtered through a youthful mind, a fact which the unnamed protagonist of Pen Pal is quite aware of. He tells us how, nearly every night, he would be lying down to sleep, drifting away before being yanked back into wakefulness and terror. It's the sort of childhood memory that never really leaves you. It just sort of fades or blurs, like a Polaroid that's been left in the sun for too long. It's hard to make out the details, but you can remember exactly how you felt when it was more than a memory. The protagonist and his mother lived alone in a rural neighborhood, surrounded by acres upon acres of fields and forests, the sort of woods that were just waiting for someone enterprising to come in, clear the lot, and plant their legacy on it. Their house itself was nothing special, just something cheap and prefabricated, affordable, but undeniably impermanent. That word, impermanence, would come to define much of the protagonist's life. I think I'm gonna go crazy if I have to keep saying the protagonist for the next 2 hours, so for the sake of convenience, I'm gonna call the main character Nathan, as a play on the author's name, Dathan. Nathan and Dathan are similar in name, experience, and personality, but they're not the same person. Nathan never really resented his childhood. His mom made sure he had the things he wanted, which wasn't hard considering he wanted relatively little. To Nathan, the greatest thing in the world was to be free, unburdened by anything or anyone holding you down. He spent his days exploring the forest beyond his backyard, but at night, the woods felt more ominous. The novelization of Pen Pal tells us that, at night, Nathan's mind took the mundane material of the woods and transformed it into a den of monsters. One of my mother's rules was that I could explore the woods on the condition that I would be home before dark. To motivate my speedy return, I would play games in my mind when leaving the woods at dusk. My feet moved more quickly when I imagined they were carrying me away from ghouls and beasts. Sometimes I'd pretend that a hideous and ravenous wolf was charging through the woods just behind me. Other times, I'd convince myself that there was an enormous clutter of spiders descending from the trees above and blanketing the earth behind, and that I was always inches away from being ensnared in a collective web. But the thing I imagined most, I think, was that if I didn't make it home before the sun went down, my mother would be gone, and that I'd be all alone. Over time, these worries extended from the woods into the crawl space under their home, and even into Nathan's room via his nightly fear of the footsteps. Things that had originally been innocent now became the domain of the dark and devious. Nathan told his mother about the footsteps, but she assured him that it was only his imagination. There were no footsteps, certainly not from any ghouls. Late one night, the footsteps came again. This time, Nathan wasn't roused by the beating of his heart, but by the chill of late winter. Nathan opened his eyes, and he saw the bottom side of the top bunk. Countless shimmering pinpricks perforated the underside of his mattress. Stars? But the mattress faded away, prompted out of existence by the incongruity and imagery. The stars remained. Nathan was lying on his back, outside. I shouldn't be here, was the first thing he thought to himself. The second thing was, where is here? A tree came into view, then trees, bushes. He was somewhere deep in the woods, and there was something else there, too. A bit of determined scrutiny revealed it to be a shark, or at least an inflatable pool float that was designed to look like a shark. Worse still, Nathan recognized that pool float, but we'll come back to that in part 4 of this story, Maps. It all seemed like a dream, but the harsh and undeniable bite of February air spoke clearly. Dream or not, a 6-year-old couldn't bear these conditions for long. Nathan's days in the forest were poor preparation for navigating them at night. Nathan recalled his nightly races against the fiends living in the woods. Had the monsters of his mind been real all along? Maybe the footsteps had been real too. Maybe there really were monsters living alongside Nathan and his mother. Wherever he was, he couldn't get back home by standing there. He picked a direction, took one solid step, and immediately sprang backwards in pain. He'd stepped on a thorn, and when he looked around himself, he realized that he was completely surrounded by the little vegetative teeth. His foot was bleeding, but otherwise, he was safe and clean. An unexpected degree of care from whatever ghoul had dragged him out of bed and into the night. Regardless of how carefully the creature had treated him, Nathan wasn't sure that he wanted to be found again. Rather than crying for help, he decided that he had to do this alone, and he employed the best established of all navigation methods, guessing to find his way out of the woods. He picked a direction and walked until his feet bled and burned, each tiny nick and scrape caked with dirt from the forest floor. Nathan shuddered to think of his mother, dousing his feet with alcohol to scour whatever microbes had claimed his cuts for their home. Nathan reflected on a memory from his childhood, a question his mother had once asked him that now, in the midst of the towering trees, almost seemed to mock him. How far can you go into the woods? Really far, was his first response, assuming the question to be a genuine inquiry about his ability to brave the forest. But that answer was rejected. It wasn't until weeks later, when Nathan asked the same question to his grandfather, that the answer was revealed.
Pop, how far can you go into the woods?
Oh, well, I'd suppose about halfway.
What? How come you can only go halfway?
Because if I went any further, I'd be coming out.
Memories like these, little, seemingly insignificant interactions, can shape a child's mind in ways that are difficult to predict. The logic behind the riddle wasn't lost on Nathan, and here, in what was undoubtedly the most dire situation of his young life, it emboldened him to stay his course. Even if he was walking deeper into the woods, eventually he would just start walking out. Nonetheless, Nathan's uncertainty and the tension in his body only grew with each step. He continued to march in as straight a line as he could manage, until the sound of a crying infant echoed through the night, catalyzing Nathan's tension into outright panic. Immediately, he abandoned his strategy for navigating the forest, and all sense of direction was traded for speed. Speed that, to Nathan's horror, led him to a familiar sight: a deflated pool float. All his progress, meager and winding though it may have been, was undone. Nathan was overcome with despair, and he began to question whether or not he would ever find peace again. But another question echoed in his mind. How far can you go into the woods? Nathan picked a star in the sky and resolved to follow it, no matter what. He didn't need to follow it all the way home. He just needed to find a landmark that he recognized, whether that be the pile of discarded Christmas trees that his best friend Josh had found, or the ditch where he and Josh had dirt wars in, or the creek he and Josh had spent a summer mapping. If these weren't the woods behind his house, he was probably doomed anyway. But if these were those woods, there was only so far he could walk without stumbling across something he remembered. They were his woods, after all. By some miraculous coincidence, it worked. The star led Nathan back to the ditch, and from there, the only concern that Nathan had was telling his mom about the experience. He was so concerned about it, in fact, that he decided that it was better not to tell her at all, and to just sneak back into bed. However, as he came around the bend on his street, he saw that sneaking in wouldn't be an option. Every light in his house was on, and his mother's silhouette was visible through the blinds. Summoning the courage to face imminent punishment, Nathan walked to the front door, reached for the knob, and was flung back into terror by the hands that suddenly grabbed him from behind. Immediately, he began to scream for help and kick at the attacker's shins. If only he could scream loud enough, his mother might hear him and come to his rescue. He was sure that whatever ghoul had hold of him now, it was the same one that dragged him into the forest, and Nathan would do anything to keep from going back. Next time, he was sure the monster wouldn't let go of its prey so easily. And eventually, the door in front of him began to swing open. But it wasn't his mother standing on the other side. Instead, it was a man, tall and broad. Hopelessness sunk its teeth into Nathan, and his will to resist waned. The tension in his body went slack, and he finally noticed the words that his attacker had been repeating over and over.
Honey, please calm down. I've got you.
It wasn't a voice of malice, but of love. It was his mother. As the man in the doorway stepped out, Nathan realized that it was a police officer. Nathan followed his mother to the kitchen table, where she explained that she'd called the police to help look for him. As it turns out, his mother had woken up in the middle of the night and found Nathan missing from his bed, replaced by a running away note on his pillow. It talked about how Nathan was unhappy with his life and how he never wanted to see his mother or any of his friends ever again. As Nathan sat at the kitchen table, one detail seemed somehow stranger than all the rest. The signature. His name was misspelled. Nathan didn't write the note. And that's the end of Footsteps, the first of Pen Pal's 6 chapters. While it's the first chapter of the story, it's far from the beginning of the story. In fact, it's from some point near the middle of the complete narrative. The novel actually introduces this chapter with a quote from the author of I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, Harlan Ellison. Now begin in the middle, and later learn the beginning. The end will take care of itself. Footsteps is but one link in a chain of memories, taken from the middle of this tale. If you're going to understand Nathan's past, we'll need to examine an earlier link in the chain, one very near the beginning. So, let's move back to Chapter 2, Balloons.
I think about what our lives might be like now if I had just let my balloon go with Chris's. or even a single second sooner or later than I did, maybe someone else would have found it and everyone would be okay.
You might be aware that Pen Pal wasn't written all at once. Instead, Footsteps was posted online as an isolated memory, and later memories were posted over time thanks to the begrudging aid of Nathan's mother. In between each chapter of the story, Nathan is continuing to uncover new memories through conversations with his mom, despite her reticence to revisit these experiences herself. That'll become really important in the final chapters of the story, and it also happens to be why Pen Pal's timeline is so screwy, for lack of a better word. Nathan's second story is a result of the first of these conversations with his mother, and it comes from about a year before his midnight walk in the woods. It starts with a description of the unique project that his kindergarten class assigned every year. See, every kid in his school was assigned into one of 4 groups: space, sea, earth, and community. Now, I'm gonna be real with you. When other kids are studying space or the sea, throwing a 5-year-old into the community group just feels mean. So naturally, that's where Nathan ended up. And hey, while I might have been disappointed with that group, Nathan seems to be fine with it for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's the group that his best friend Josh was also put into. And secondly, because of the balloon project. See, while community is a pretty vague concept to try to communicate to a bunch of kindergartners, the school did a pretty good job of getting the kids invested. The idea was to give the kids each a helium balloon, to which they would attach a note introducing themselves and the school. Once the balloon was released, it would float away before eventually sinking back down to the ground. If somebody found the balloon, they could write a response, take a picture of the area they found it, and send it back to the school so the kids could see where the balloon had ended up. Most importantly, however, each note would encourage the finder to send back a return address, so each child would have a new friend to correspond with, a member of the community, a pen pal. While the majority of kids in Nathan's class were primarily concerned with the color of their balloons, Nathan was excited about the project because he was eager to show off how good he was at writing his own name. That's also part of why the misspelled name on the running away note from Footsteps was so alarming. It just wasn't the sort of mistake Nathan would have made. So, when Balloon Day finally rolled around, the other kids fought for their favorite colored balloons, and Nathan focused on writing his note.
Hi, you found my balloon. My name is Nathan, and I attend Ewald Elementary School. You can keep the balloon, but I hope you write me back. I like Mighty Max, exploring, building forts, swimming, and friends. What do you like? Write me back soon. Here's $1 for the mail.
Inside the envelope, right alongside the note, Nathan inserted $1, but not just any dollar. No, this was $1 with the words 4 stamps written in the telltale script of a child, just in case Nathan's new pen pal didn't realize what the dollar was for. Additionally, each child was given a note from the teacher detailing the particulars of the project and the mailing address for the school. The idea of the project was to help the kids build a sense of community without leaving the school. That was supposed to be safer, but well, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but this whole thing is all pretty concerning. Sending out information this way means the school has no control over who the letters reach. Nonetheless, the project went on. The teachers would be screening all of the letters before they reached the children, so that would ensure that nothing vile made its way to their little hands. When it was finally time to release the balloons, Nathan's class gathered outside the school for a photo. At the count of 3, they were all going to release their balloons together. At least, that was the plan. Before the count even began, one student, Chris, just kind of let go. As with many things in Pen Pal, that detail sounds super unimportant, but in the last chapter, it'll become particularly relevant. Shortly after the kids finished laughing at their overly eager classmate, the teacher snapped a Polaroid of the moment the rest of the balloons took to the skies. As days turned to weeks, the class started to receive their letters along with Polaroids from where the balloons had landed. The teacher would take each picture as it came in and pin it to a wall map in the classroom so that the kids could see where all the balloons had made it to. Each day, Nathan would return to school in hopes that he'd received a response to his carefully crafted note, and each day, he would leave disappointed. He started to think that he would have to write to another student's pen pal just to participate in the project, but long after most of the class had grown tired of writing letters, Nathan's first reply finally came in. At long last, Nathan had a pen pal of his own, except something was wrong. "Don't be disappointed," Nathan's teacher said as she handed him an envelope. While most children got written letters explaining the context for the photos their pen pal sent, Nathan only received a single Polaroid. It was too blurry to make out what it was or where it was taken, and without a letter to explain it, or a return address to establish a correspondence, it seemed that the picture would remain a mystery. Nathan was initially heartbroken. Why didn't the person who found his balloon want to write to him? Should he have given them more than a single dollar for stamps? Many of the other kids were already excitedly receiving their second letters, but it already seemed like this was where Nathan's relationship to his pen pal would end. In an attempt to console him, the teacher left Nathan with a few final words before she returned to her desk. "A picture is worth 1,000 words, right?" As he looked at the blurry image in front of him, he wasn't sure he believed that to be true. Then came another Polaroid. This one was equally as cryptic as the first, and so were the dozens of others that poured in over the course of the school year. As the project wrapped up and the semester came to a close, the children were finally allowed to bring all of their pictures and letters home from school. Nathan's best friend, Josh, brought home the second most out of the entire class. 4 in total. You can only write so many letters to a random kindergartner before it becomes tedious and, well, more than a little creepy. Nathan took home nearly 50 Polaroids, each one distorted, out of focus, and altogether boring. I mean, sure, the number of them was high, but blurry photos are helpless to capture the fleeting attention of a 5-year-old, least of all at the start of summer break. The indecipherable images went home and were promptly stuffed away in a drawer in Nathan's room. And there, they sat forgotten until late into the following summer. Nathan and Josh spent the first several weeks of summer exploring the woods, attempting to chart the vast expanse of forest that connected their houses to each other. However, that's a story that can wait until chapter 4. As thrilling as wandering the woods together was, the boys eventually decided that a more practical use of their summer was to set up a snow cone stand and make some money. Nathan's snow cone machine had been a Christmas gift from his mother, which had prompted Josh to beg his parents for something equivalent. Instead, they'd bought him a slightly nicer, slightly larger machine, which suggests to me that Josh's parents must have been a little bit better off than Nathan's mom. The friends decided that they would attract the best business by selling cones for $1 in front of Nathan's house on the weekends. Their first weekend, they only managed to make about $6. They weren't exactly experts, and each customer left with a little bit of ice and a cup full of cherry syrup, full to the point that it spilled out and dyed their hands red. Even so, the next weekend, they managed to have a repeat customer, a man who came by, joked with the boys a bit, bought a snow cone of questionable quality, and then went on his way. The third weekend was their most successful day of business. Once again, the man returned to exchange a couple of dollars, and they also received a visit from one of Nathan's neighbors, Mrs. Maggie. She was an older woman who lived alone in the neighborhood, and she had taken a liking to Josh and Nathan, offering to let them swim in the lake behind her home throughout the summer. She too will become more important once we get to chapter 4. The fifth weekend marked their final day of business because a couple of days later, Nathan's mom would take away his snow cone machine. She said it was because she didn't want him hurting himself with it. There'd been an incident where he accidentally sliced his finger on the machine's internal blades a couple of weeks back, but that had been, well, a couple of weeks back. Why take it away now, after he'd had several more chances to hurt himself? There are many moments in Nathan's childhood that wouldn't make any sense to him until years later once he revisited them with an adult mind. This event, like many others, struck him as odd even as a child, but the actions of adults are often confusing to a kid. You're just expected to accept it and move on. Nothing of any real note happened on the final 2 weekends aside from a slightly better business. That is, until it came time for Nathan and Josh to divvy up the earnings from their final day of business. They'd made about $17, and after a quick game of rock, paper, scissors to decide who got the odd dollar out, they split it evenly. However, as Josh was paying Nathan from the neat stack of bills, one of them stood out from the rest. It had been written on with a Sharpie. 4 stamps, it read. Nathan was astounded that the dollar he'd sent away for the balloon project had made its way back to him. Excitedly, he immediately pointed out the coincidence to Josh, and while he thought it was cool, he didn't seem to grasp the magnitude of the situation as fully as Nathan. How many times had it changed hands, passing from one person to the next, before it had finally made its way home? How far had it traveled? Who had received it? In some distant way, Nathan felt closer to his pen pal than ever, even if his collection of Polaroids had brought nothing but disappointment. Speaking of, those Polaroids were the perfect way for Nathan to communicate to Josh just how amazing this turn of events really was. He led Josh inside to share his odd array of pictures, hoping that it would spark greater enthusiasm. Unfortunately, after looking for only 10 minutes, Josh lost interest and suggested that they go have a dirt war in the ditch. And while Nathan agreed, he was still awestruck by just how improbable it all was. This is the first time that Pen Pal starts to explicitly deal with one of its main themes: coincidence. Often, seemingly disconnected events come together to influence our lives in greater ways than we could ever predict. For instance, this channel probably wouldn't exist without me having a falling out with a friend like 13 or 14 years ago. That friendship's end led to me watching a lot more YouTube, and if that never happened, I might never have gotten into horror, and I wouldn't have found Pen Pal. If I'd handled my friendships a little better as a kid, or if I'd taken up a sport instead of becoming chronically online, or even if I'd said maybe later, when a reading of Pen Pal first popped up in my recommended videos, I don't think that I would have fallen so deeply in love with horror, and I certainly wouldn't have started a YouTube channel to talk about it. I'll talk about this more towards the end of the video, but this story has also affected a lot of my relationships in some pretty big ways. Thankfully, my life has been shaped for the better by all these little coincidences. But Pen Pal won't take this idea in such a positive direction. At every turn, the right mistakes were made for Nathan's life to spiral deeper into tragedy. These little errors may seem insignificant in isolation. You may not even recognize them as pieces of a greater puzzle. However, once you see the whole image, with each fragmented memory joined together, it's hard not to wonder how different the picture might have been if even a single mistake had been avoided. After leaving the stack of Polaroids behind, the boys ventured into the woods beyond Nathan's house, out towards the ditch that they frequented to have snowball fights with the mud. As they flung dirt at each other, they started to notice a sound coming from deeper in the woods, beyond the brush marking the edge of their vision. Since they couldn't quite see whatever was making the noise, the boys argued about what was out here in the woods with them. As we saw in Footsteps, the mind of a child can take something familiar and twist it into something fantastic. The strange sound became the groans of a mummy to Nathan's mind, but for Josh, the whirring, clicking, metallic sound had to be from a robot. On second consideration, Nathan agreed that something so mechanical sounding probably had to be a robot, and that was a satisfying enough answer for the boys' return to their soil slinging. That night, well after Josh had gone home and well after his bedtime, Nathan once again returned to the collection of Polaroids in his room. He took one of the little square photographs off the top of the stack and looked over it, examining it in greater detail than he ever had before. This photo would have been one of the last he'd received before the end of the project. It looked nearly as blurry as the others, and... wait. He looked at the photo more closely as a warm, sick feeling began to well up in his stomach. He'd hardly looked at the later photos he'd received, but still, how had he never noticed this before? Nathan was in this picture. It was blurry, but it was undeniably him. He picked up another of them and realized that there, at the edge of the frame, was his face once again. He began to go through the entire stack of images, checking each one for any signs of himself and laying out all 50 pictures in a grid. To his utter horror, Nathan was in every last photograph. Eventually, he arrived at the first photograph he had received. Sure enough, there he was. I'm not sure how the school didn't catch it, but then I'm not sure why the school allowed a project like this to happen in the first place. This revelation made Nathan feel afraid. Not to say that he understood the implication of the photos. Instead, Nathan was overcome with the sense that he had done something wrong. It wasn't the fear of being in danger, but the uncomfortable mingling of guilt and anxiety that comes with being in trouble. It was out of that fear that Nathan initially decided to conceal the photos from his mother. It was late, and he didn't want to get in even deeper trouble for being awake when he should have been sleeping. When the sun came up the next day, Nathan finally decided that even if he got in trouble, telling his mother was the best option. I think it's fair to assume that, despite being young and not understanding fully, some small part of the boy recognized that this was a dangerous secret to keep.
Mom, can you come here? I have these pictures. Just a minute, honey. I need to mark these on the calendar.
It took some effort to get his mother's attention. She was too busy thumbing through a stack of mail that she'd just brought in. Nonetheless, Nathan pushed on. He reminded her of the balloon project and of the first blurry photographs he'd received. He recounted how the pictures kept coming in for weeks after everyone else's, and he explained how he'd never brought them up again since they were all so unclear. Finally, he attempted to show her the photographs. Despite his efforts, Nathan's mother was more focused on the mail than she was on Nathan. Behind him, she stood holding the contents of a small square envelope, her hands trembling. When her mind recovered from the shock of what she saw, she dropped the mail on the kitchen table in front of Nathan and rushed for the phone. At this point, he was profoundly confused by her reaction, but more so, that dreadful sense that he'd done something wrong was magnified 1,000 times by his mother's sudden hysteria. He started to do the only thing he could do. He started to apologize to her. While he said his "I'm sorries" to a mother that hardly heard him in the moment, he absently picked at the corner of the envelope she'd been hiding, pulling free its contents. Inside was a Polaroid. However, this photograph wasn't from the stack that Nathan had brought to the table, and this one was much clearer, closer. This time, Nathan was centered in the frame. Josh was there too. They sent the confusion into even greater spirals. Nathan's mother paced back into the room, panic written across her face, and the landline pressed to her ear.
Mom, who are you calling?
Nathan pleaded. Finally, she extended a moment of attention to her son.
I'm calling the police.
He'd been right. He had done something wrong.
Why are you calling the police? I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I'm so sorry.
Tears began to well up in his mother's eyes, and she told Nathan the truth. A truth that he wouldn't understand for many years. A hurtful truth. She brushed aside his photographs and the rest of the mail, grabbing the new Polaroid's envelope and holding it up to Nathan's face.
I have to call the police. I have to call them. Because there is no postmark.
Chapter 2 of Pen Pal ends with the titular character being much, much too close for comfort. Turns out, there had never been any robot in the woods. The mysterious mechanical noise that Nathan and Josh had heard was from something much more mundane. A Polaroid camera. The photo that had been taken while the friends were playing had been hand-delivered to Nathan's doorstep. No astonishing coincidence had returned Nathan's marked bill to him. It was all a result of malicious design. But, of course, none of that proved that Nathan's stalker was close. That was evident the moment the boy recognized himself in the photos from the balloon project. Instead, the delivery of the picture means something much, much more sinister. Whoever is watching Nathan isn't content to be an observer.
I suspected that it all really was because of the night we snuck back to my old house, and even though I couldn't know for certain, my voice trembled and quaked as I told him that Boxes was my cat, and that it wasn't fair for him to hold that night against me for so long.
In typical fashion for this story, the reveal at the end of Chapter 2 is followed by several unrelated memories from Nathan's childhood. Chapter 3, Boxes, begins with the earliest memories from the entire book, before the footsteps, before the pen pal, and even before Josh. Instead, Chapter 3 begins quite appropriately with Nathan in the woods, climbing a tree. With very little else to do, Nathan spent a lot of his time climbing the trees behind his home. Before he had even finished preschool, Nathan was able to climb to the highest branches of any of the trees in the neighborhood, so the summer before kindergarten was spent learning to climb faster. One day, when Nathan was climbing, he got too confident, and he let go of one branch before he had securely taken hold of the next. A moment later, he tumbled nearly 20 feet to the ground, not far enough to be lethal, but far enough to generate a distinct snap upon impact. When Nathan tried to push himself upright, his arm gave out on him, bending sharply at an unnatural angle. The only thing Nathan remembered after that was the surprise of seeing just how white his bone was. That one simple mistake, a single moment of overconfidence, had some pretty major consequences for Nathan. Firstly, it ensured that he wouldn't be climbing trees anytime soon. Secondly, it meant that he would have to start school as the boy with a broken arm, and he didn't even have friends to sign the cast. He would be different from the other kids, and that meant he'd have a target on his back. Wishing there was more she could do for her son, Nathan's mother decided that even if she couldn't do much to ensure Nathan was treated well by other kids, she could make sure that he wasn't alone. No matter what, she had to make sure that Nathan had a friend. To that end, the day before Nathan's first day of kindergarten, their family of 2 grew to 3 with the arrival of a new kitten, a little tan and white tabby. As soon as it arrived, it immediately crawled into a box to hide, earning itself a name: Boxes. Boxes was declawed, so they generally tried to keep him indoors. However, as anyone with cats is aware, they tend to thwart even the most thorough plans of protection at least once in a while. Boxes would often dart out of the house to chase critters like lizards or bugs in the yard. In that sense, he was quite a bit like Nathan himself. There was nothing greater to Boxes than the freedom to explore, and there was nowhere greater to explore than the crawl space. I mentioned earlier that Nathan and his mother lived in a mobile home, the sort that's supported by a foundation of large concrete blocks which create a big open area under the house. Eventually, nearly any time Boxes would manage to escape, he would flee to this refuge beneath the floorboards and would hide out, holding himself hostage until his family presented him with a ransom worth taking. Most often, that turned out to be canned tuna. Sooner or later, just the sound of the electric can opener was enough to get him running out from under the house, and that became the routine. At least, it was the routine until after Nathan had started school, met Josh, and participated in the balloon project. The mess with the Polaroids, the footsteps, and the pen pal changed the routine entirely. After the events of Chapter 2, it became clear to Nathan's mom that the neighborhood was unsafe, but she wasn't exactly well off, and a sudden move was an expensive undertaking. About a year later, she scraped together enough savings to move someplace far enough to keep them safe, and close enough for Nathan and Josh to stay friends. I imagine that some of you, like myself, think that it was a mistake to stay anywhere even remotely near their old home. However, this chapter is the first to dive into the most important aspect of Pen Pal as a whole. If you're unfamiliar with the story, you might guess that the most essential element of the narrative is the connection between Nathan and his mother, or maybe Nathan and the Pen Pal. Don't get me wrong, those things are definitely important, but at the end of the day, Pen Pal is ultimately a story about the friendship between Nathan and Josh, and nothing is more important for understanding the meaning behind this story than understanding how important this friendship was to both of these boys. I think Nathan's mother understood how important and special the bond between Nathan and Josh was, and that is why she decided to stay closer than she otherwise would have. The last day in their old home wasn't meant to be the last. While Nathan and his mother loaded things into the car to make their anticipated moving day a bit easier, Boxes managed to slip out the door and dart around to the crawl space once more. This time, however, the strategy of tempting the cat back out with a can opener wasn't an option. It had already been packed away, and Nathan's mother wasn't about to start digging through every box in the house to find it. She decided that she was just going to have to crawl in after him and drag him out, whether he liked it or not. Her expedition was successful. Nathan watched his mother shimmy on her belly into the musty, cramped space beneath the house. For whatever reason, there was an awful smell emanating from the hatch that led into the crawl space. A couple of minutes later, his mother emerged, victoriously gripping the squirming cat, but her face had darkened significantly. That was when she told him that they would be leaving the house that day, as soon as possible. She spoke as if this was some sort of exciting development, which clashed with her expression that clearly communicated that something was wrong. Nathan protested at first. They were supposed to have more time in this house. His clothes weren't even all packed, and besides, Josh was supposed to come over for a hangout later that day. Nonetheless, the complaints of a 6-year-old are rarely persuasive to an adult. Nathan's mother assured him that they could just replace anything that was left behind later, and that was the end of the conversation, as well as the end of Nathan's time in his childhood home. After this, Nathan and Josh's friendship became a lot harder to maintain. Even so, the boys and their parents put in the work to keep them close. That Christmas, the friends would each receive a gift that would make keeping in touch much, much easier. A pair of walkie-talkies that the boys could use to communicate with each other whenever they wanted. They were powerful enough to work across the city, and they had been very expensive. I'm sure that was hard for Nathan's mother to make happen, but it was special enough for Nathan to remember it fondly, even as an adult. With so few happy memories from childhood, I think that was certainly worth the cost in the end. While the handheld radios were perfectly capable of transmitting messages between the boys' homes, they liked the walkie-talkies so much that they ended up using them even during their hangouts, communicating with each other in mock military speak, pretending to send secret messages to each other. Despite the distance that now separated their homes, the boys continued to grow closer to one another, even for all the support that their families gave. The events surrounding the balloon project still resulted in some new restrictions for Nathan. Firstly, Nathan was expressly forbidden from going into the woods, alone or with Josh. Once, they had broken this rule. Nathan's mother had screamed at him for that, threatening to never let him go to Josh's house again if they ever repeated the mistake. The second change was that whenever Nathan was staying over at Josh's house, his mother had to check in with him via phone at least a few times throughout the stay. Nathan was used to it, but Josh was a bit perplexed as to why Nathan's mother was so watchful over him. His parents were much more relaxed about the hangouts. Knowing about the situation that Nathan had been through in kindergarten, they really shouldn't have been so lax about things, but that's the thing. They didn't know. Honestly, the greatest mistake Nathan's mother made wasn't the fact she didn't move far enough away. It wasn't even the fact that she continued to let Nathan venture near their old neighborhood during his visits with Josh. Her greatest mistake was that she never told Josh's parents anything about the balloon project, Nathan's running away note, the Polaroids, or the pen pal. I'm not really sure why she didn't tell them. Maybe she was afraid that telling them would destroy Nathan's relationship with Josh, and maybe she was right about that. But if she had told them, I don't know, maybe the story would have gone a little differently than it does. But we'll get to that. Let's just finish the chapter. Things continued like that, with Nathan and Josh growing alongside each other, with Nathan's mother anxiously watching over her son, and with Josh's parents being none the wiser, for almost 4 years. Then, when Nathan was 10 years old, something happened that changed the whole situation dramatically. There's a reason why this chapter is named after Nathan's pet cat. Though, as an aside, I do want to say that I love the double meaning here, since the cat's name is Boxes, but it's also a chapter about Nathan packing his life into cardboard boxes and moving into a new home. I just think that's kind of clever. Anyway, the chapter didn't just start with a bunch of exposition about Nathan's childhood cat for no reason. One night, when Nathan was staying over at Josh's house, his mother called to check on him as per usual. Only, this time, something was wrong. Even over the phone, Nathan could tell that she was anxious about something. After a bit of prying, she divulged that she was upset because earlier that day, Boxes had slipped out of the house again, and she had not been able to coax him back inside. She promised that he would come back, but what if he didn't? Nathan was devastated. Boxes had been his friend even longer than Josh, and now he was just gone? It couldn't be that simple. Nathan started to think about if there was anything that could be done to fix the situation, and that's when he realized the issue. What if, to Boxes, he hadn't run away from home? but rather was returning home. In his mind, home might still be the house with the crawl space, the woods, and the cans of tuna. After all, Nathan still considered it his home too. Josh agreed that seemed like a possibility and suggested his dad could drive them over in the morning, but that would be too late. Boxes had been declawed, and Nathan was worried that something might attack the defenseless cat during the night. Besides, his mother told him they could never go back to his old home. A new family had moved in, and they wouldn't want the previous owners just lurking around. This was a problem Nathan had to solve, and he needed Josh's help. They were but a walk through the woods from Nathan's childhood home, and that night, Nathan broke every rule that was meant to keep him safe. The consequences were disastrous. While Nathan's old home was, indeed, just on the other side of the woods behind Josh's house, we already saw just how expansive these woods were back in Chapter 1. The forest connected several neighborhoods together, and Nathan's was by no means the closest. That night, once Veronica, Josh's older sister, and his parents had gone to sleep, the boys gathered their walkie-talkies and a flashlight. They continued to joke quietly to one another while they searched, which made it much harder to avoid waking anyone. But they were best friends. That was simply the most natural way for them to interact. Once they had everything, they slipped out Josh's window and trod off into the woods. Even just 4 years after the events of Footsteps, the night woods felt completely different to Nathan. I mean, he was 10 years old now. That's practically a grown-up. He wasn't afraid of things like ghouls hiding out in the forest or hordes of spiders descending from the dark canopies above. Still, it was awful dark, and he was glad Josh was with him. The path through the woods was long, made longer still by the distinct lack of a path. They'd explored these woods countless times, but that didn't mean it was easy to maintain a sense of direction, especially when you're constantly chit-chatting with your best friend.
How much further do you think it is?
Nathan asked, hoping his friend's memory served better than his own.
A while, I guess?
Well, what's a while mean?
I don't know, man. On the right side, how far can you walk into the woods, right?
That was the last thing Nathan expected Josh to say. The memory of his lost night in the woods was one he tried hard to forget. He hated being reminded of how he felt. Trapped, helpless, the undeniable sense of some malicious force pressing down on him from the darkness. Just then, the strap of Nathan's walkie-talkie snagged on a low-hanging branch. He could hardly see anything, so he was forced to tug blindly at the strap in an attempt to free himself. The shadows had primed his mind for fear, and it was hard not to feel like he had been grabbed by something. His imagination once again began to conjure images of the thing which now clutched him. He struggled against the woody fingers which refused to let him go, until Josh spoke up once more, and Nathan's panic faded in an instant.
Hey man, wanna go for a swim?
Nathan looked over to where Josh stood with a new, colder fear. It was like someone afraid of drowning suddenly realized that dry land never existed to begin with, only an endless, all-consuming ocean. Nathan didn't panic that he was in imminent danger. He simply realized that danger was a permanent fixture of his life. He looked with despair at Josh laying on top of a flattened pool float. They were in the same spot Nathan had woken up in all those years ago. Regaining a small bit of composure, Nathan gave another firm yank to the strap of his radio, and the branch unexpectedly gave way. He lost his balance, took a hard step to right himself, and felt the dirt under his foot give way. Nathan inverted, toppling into a pit on the forest floor. Oddly, the first thing Nathan considered was the image of this clearing from when he'd been lost before. The layout had been seared into his mind, but he couldn't remember this massive crater at all. It was new. Someone had dug this hole. Nathan rose on shaking legs when, above, Josh began to scream. Nathan scrambled to the wall of the pit, clawing at the loose dirt in an attempt to hoist himself out of the hole. It was shallow, but he was still dazed from the fall. Outside the hole, pale starlight barely illuminated his friend as he squirmed atop the shark. The flashlight's beam danced, panicked through the trees before being tossed aside. Nathan responded as quickly as he could to Josh's pleas for help, snatching up the light and pointing it at his friend to assess their surroundings. There was no one nearby, but Nathan pointed the beam at Josh, who was furiously beating at his arms and face. The light revealed a scattered layer of tiny bodies, each with 8 writhing legs. Dozens of the spiders crawled across Josh's skin, and countless more invaded his clothing. Nathan helped Josh to his feet, and the boy threw his shirt to the ground, swatting away as many spiders as he could. The float was infested, and Josh had disturbed them by laying on their home. They stood in the clearing for some time, surveying themselves and picking off arachnids, before they finally refocused and continued on their mission. It saddened Nathan to see how poorly the new owners maintained his home. The yard was entirely untrimmed, and the house was in need of major repairs. The previously oppressive sense of impermanence the house lent to Nathan's life now gave way to an all-consuming decay. There were no signs that anyone had moved into the house after Nathan and his mother had left. The place was entirely abandoned, so why wasn't he supposed to come back here? Despite patrolling the outside of the house, there were still no signs of Boxes. Both boys were growing increasingly concerned about him. It was Nathan's cat, but Josh had known Boxes for years, too. After the incident with the spiders, they had calmed down by sharing stories about Boxes, one after another. Those stories likely helped embolden them to take the next step towards reuniting with Nathan's pet. After all, whenever Boxes escaped in the past, he rarely roamed the exterior of the house. He was more interested in finding a nook to hide in. It took some effort for the boys to pry open the entrance to the crawl space. It had a heavy board sealing it shut, and once they got it off, the stench of must and rot hit like breath from a filthy mouth. It smelled worse than the house looked. No matter how eager they were to help Boxes, it was smarter for them to split the search. One boy to explore the interior above, and one to brave the dark, smelly confines below. A game of rock, paper, scissors determined who would take the less desirable job of searching the crawl space. Slithering across the muck underneath his home, it was obvious Nathan wouldn't have an easy time explaining how filthy he was without his mother finding out they'd disobeyed her. Mud clung to his shirt, which was a shame considering it was his favorite. It had a picture of a lizard reclining on the beach, below which was printed, "Iguana another fly tie." Nathan had no idea what that meant, but he liked the lizard quite a lot, and it was from a trip with his grandparents. That shirt was a memento of happy times, and that made it precious to him. He sunk his fingers into the grime and pulled his body along, dragging himself deeper into the crawl space and creating a dark smear of rank sludge across his chest. If only he'd thrown rock instead, Josh would be the one crawling through the darkness while Nathan searched up above. To that point, if only his mother hadn't made them move all those years ago, neither boy would have needed to go into the crawl space. Nathan, his mother, and Boxes could have all been safe and warm at home together. Nathan reached back a stained hand and retrieved his walkie-talkie. "Josh, are you there?"
This is Macho Man. Come back.
"Josh, cut it out. There's something wrong down here.
What do you mean?
It stinks. It smells like something died.
Oh man, is it Boxes?
I really hope not." The layout of the crawlspace was such that, from where Nathan had entered, he could only see part of it. He shined his flashlight around looking for Boxes, but there were no signs of him. He called out, but to no avail. The further he went, the worse the smell became. He called for Boxes again, breathing in through his mouth for a moment, but the odor was so powerful that he could taste the death stench on the air. He tried spitting to remove the flavor of rot, but it hung in his throat. Nathan was becoming more afraid that he would find Boxes than not. A few more solid tugs on the slick floor pulled Nathan to a section of the crawlspace far from the entrance. Even with the flashlight, it was nearly impossible to see, and he felt his way forward as much as he saw. His heart sank when he reached around a corner of wall and felt fur. I prepared myself emotionally for what I was about to see. I crawled slowly so I could prolong what I knew was coming, and I inched my eyes and the flashlight past the block to see what was on the other side. I staggered back in horror and disgust. It was a hideous and twisted creature, badly decomposed. Its skin had rotted away on its face, so the teeth were revealed, and an ever-present sneer that made them look enormous. Its eyes had either sunk back into its skull,
or were simply gone altogether, but I still felt like it was looking right at me. The smell radiating from it was unbearable.
Nathan shouted in fear when he saw the face. Immediately, Josh's voice buzzed from the walkie-talkie.
Are you okay? Is it boxes?
No, I don't think so.
Well, what the hell is it then?
It's a raccoon.
We'll keep looking. I'm gonna go into the house and see if he might have made it in there somehow.
Josh had replaced the board that sealed the crawl space behind Nathan, leaving him and possibly Boxes trapped inside for the time being. He assured him, however, that it would budge easily if prompted. This way, Boxes wouldn't escape again as soon as Nathan found him, if he found him. A few minutes later, Nathan could hear squeaks and thuds above. Josh had found a way inside.
Be careful, and don't touch anything.
Don't worry, man. I won't touch your Barbie collection.
Ha. You remember your way around inside, right?
Yeah, I think so. Where do you think I should look?
He used to sit on the washer or dryer sometimes, but if he's not there, then try my room. There's a bunch of my old clothes still in boxes there. Check to see if he crawled in one, I guess. And make sure to bring your walkie.
Roger that, good buddy. Man, it's dark in here. Hey, are you sure that you had boxes of clothes in here? I don't see any.
Yeah, there should be a couple boxes in front of the closet.
There aren't any boxes. Let me check to see if you maybe put them in the closet or something before you left.
While he waited for an update, Nathan continued to survey the area around him. Shifting to avoid getting any closer to the raccoon's carcass, his foot brushed up against something that clinked in the darkness. He turned to locate the source of the sound and saw a small saucer, the sort of bowl that you would use to feed an animal. It sat amidst a collection of other similar bowls that all rested together on a moldy blanket. A few bowls still had leftover cat food in them, and initially, Nathan thought his mother must have set them out.
I found your clothes.
Oh, cool. Where were the boxes?
Like I said, there are no boxes. Your clothes are in your closet. They're hanging up.
That can't be right, Josh. They're supposed to be in boxes. I put them in boxes. Stop messing around and just come back outside.
No joke, man, I'm looking at them. Maybe you just thought you left them all packed up. Wow, talk about an ego.
What? What do you mean?
Your walls, man. Your walls are covered in Polaroids of yourself. There are like hundreds of them. What do you hire someone to... There's someone in the house.
Above, in another part of the house, Nathan could hear heavy, dragging footsteps. They wandered around the house for a bit, and Nathan held his breath, silent. Then they began moving towards his room, towards Josh. Nathan began to cry. Josh was his only friend besides Boxes, his best friend. Now, what would happen to him if he was found? Nathan was so scared that something would happen to Josh, but he was even more afraid of what might happen to himself if he tried to help. More noises were coming from his bedroom. Another heavy thud. But he couldn't move.
He's got something, man. It's a big bag. He just threw it on the floor. And, oh, God, man, the bag. I think it just moved.
Josh spoke only in a whisper, which Nathan took to mean that he hadn't been found yet. He tried to get a better view of the area under Josh, looking far back towards the corner of the house where his bedroom was. The flashlight beam revealed cobwebs, dirt, and the true source of the unbearable scent that filled the crawl space. There, beyond the bowls and blankets, was an array of corpses. The bodies of dozens of animals had rotted into each other over what must have been years, now fused into an enormous and inseparable heap of flesh, bone, and fur. The thinner bits of skin around their eyes and mouths had completely fallen away, leaving behind an assortment of snarling, staring faces. permanently fixed in expressions of anguish. Something slammed inside the house, and Josh screamed so loud that Nathan could hear him through the floorboards. He had been found. Frantically pushing himself back from the swell of decaying meat, Nathan returned to the entrance of the crawlspace and began desperately pushing on the board that sealed him in. When that didn't work, he took to kicking it. When that too failed, his tears came faster, and he cursed Josh. He had put the board back in the wrong way, and now Nathan was trapped. It would only be a matter of time until the board shifted in front of him, and moonlight poured in. Fingers wrapped around Nathan's wrist and began dragging him from the hole. A child's hand. Somehow, Josh had managed to get out of the house safely, and he had immediately rushed to Nathan's aid, a far cry from the cowardice that Nathan had shown only moments before. The boys took off and tried to hop the fence between the house and the woods, but the strap of Josh's walkie-talkie snagged on the fence as he toppled over it. Nathan screamed for him to leave it behind, and the pair darted back into the woods. Behind them, someone shouted and wailed into the night. Nathan couldn't tell what the man was saying. The cries of anguished fury seemed to contain no words at all, but they still served to propel Nathan and Josh even faster into the night. They didn't stop running until they arrived back at Josh's house. The whole way home, Josh only said one thing.
My picture. He took my picture.
Nathan felt guilty hearing how much this disturbed Josh because he knew that wasn't the first picture that man had taken of Josh. The first picture was the one that had been delivered to their front door without postage. The one that had prompted Nathan's move in the first place. Despite the guilt, Nathan followed his mother's example and kept that a secret. Upon their return, Nathan borrowed a fresh set of clothes from Josh and took one last look at the lizard on his shirt before throwing it into the trash. Neither boy was able to sleep at all that night. They just stayed awake by the window, watching the woods, hoping they wouldn't see the man wandering after them. He never did. The following morning, Nathan's mother arrived to take him home. She never found out what happened that night. At least, she wouldn't know about it for many, many years. As I said earlier, many pieces of the puzzle that is Pen Pal come from recent conversations that Nathan shares with his mother. In general, she's pretty guarded when it comes to discussing Nathan's childhood, however. So, one day, as a bit of a gamble, Nathan decided to tell her the story I just told you. He hoped that, by telling her something she didn't know, she might reciprocate and give him a new piece of the puzzle. He wanted to know why she had lied to him. Why she had told him that someone else had moved in when they never had. Why had she tried so hard to keep him from returning to his childhood home? Instead of answers, Nathan finally received a scolding that he probably should have received that morning all those years ago. Because I never put any blankets or bowls under the house for boxes. You think you were the only one to find them there? Don't you tell me that I lied to you about there being someone in that house. No one had moved into the house after Nathan and his mother had left. No, the Pen Pal wasn't nearly patient enough for that. He made his home directly below them, and when they left, he had nowhere else to go. That move had worked, and for 4 years, Nathan got to be a normal kid. For 4 years, his mother, Josh, and Josh's family worked hard to give Nathan good memories. After that night when he and Josh returned to the old home, good memories became rare. When Nathan finally got home, fear, despair, and exhaustion caught up to him. He dropped his things across the floor of his bedroom, fell into bed, and immediately slipped into unconsciousness. Late that night, he woke up to a familiar sound. The meowing of a cat. His cat. Boxes had finally come home. I'd like to end this section by reading you the end of this chapter as it's written. My heart leapt. He had finally come home. I was a little sick about the fact that if I had just waited a day, none of the previous night's events would have happened, and I'd have boxes anyway. But that didn't matter. He was back. I got off my bed and called for him, looking around to catch a glint of light off his eyes. The crying continued, and I followed it. It was coming from under the bed. I laughed a little, thinking that I had just crawled under a house looking for him, and how this was so much better. His meows were being muffled by a jacket, so I flung it aside and smiled, yelling, "Welcome home, boxes!" His cries were coming from my walkie-talkie. Boxes never came home.
That was our first great adventure. Despite everything that had happened, he had kept the map in his pocket for almost 3 years. The beginning of Maps takes us back to Nathan's first semester of kindergarten, before the dangers of this story became apparent. At the time, Nathan's mother was less protective, and she was generally content to let her son roam the neighborhood and the woods with Josh. Part of that roaming came in the form of swimming in the lake behind one of Nathan's nearest neighbors, an 80-year-old woman named Ms. Maggie. She lived in a house down the street with a broken sprinkler system that tended to run through the night. In the winter, the constant spray of water would coat Miss Maggie's yard in ice, leaving icicles hanging from the trees and a layer of frost across the grass. It was surreal to behold, especially when the surrounding houses were still dry and barren. Nathan always remembered Miss Maggie being nice, if a little strange. Whenever he and Josh would swim behind her house, she would usually walk down to the water to chat with them. Sometimes she would even offer to let the boys come inside for snacks or to play games. She seemed to love seeing them, and once she even gave them a gift, an inflatable shark for them to use when they played in the lake. Despite her hospitality, Nathan's mother discouraged the boys from accepting too many kindnesses from her. She didn't want them to inadvertently take advantage of the woman's condition. Often, Mrs. Maggie became confused when talking to Nathan and Josh. Rather than calling them by their names, she would use the wrong names altogether, Chris and John. Once, the boys had gotten in trouble for using those names with each other to mock Mrs. Maggie, and they'd gotten scolded for that. Nathan's mother knew what they didn't. Mrs. Maggie's chain of memories was twisted with dementia, past and present knotted up in an inseparable tangle. Either Nathan and Josh resembled her sons, Chris and John, or maybe her mind just projected what she wanted to see over reality. Her mind was reaching out, desperately trying to comprehend a world that no longer made sense. She would always tell Nathan that her husband, Tom, would be home soon, though Nathan later learned that Tom had been dead for years. Her sons worked out payment plans to keep her house maintained and her utilities running, so they never had to visit. A woman who had forgotten so much was herself mostly forgotten. But Nathan would never forget his last conversation with Ms. Maggie. The series of events leading to that conversation started with Nathan and Josh's decision to chart the woods between their houses. They'd never actually walked from one house to the other, and they were curious if the tributary that ran near Mrs. Maggie and Nathan's houses was connected to the creek by Josh's place. For two explorative 5-year-olds eager for adventure, that curiosity was motivation enough for them to start planning. They decided that they would make 2 maps, one starting at Josh's house and one at Nathan's. Then, once the maps had expanded, they would attempt to fuse them together into one comprehensive map of the woods that formed the heart of their neighborhoods. This plan was aided greatly by the fact that Nathan and Josh had been placed in different school groups that semester. Since they couldn't see each other at school, their parents had decided that it would be okay for the boys to have sleepovers most weekends. That gave them all the time in the world to enact their plan. Even so, a plan does not a good cartographer make, because, as you remember, these are 5-year-old boys. Their map-making process was full of estimations and guesswork, leading to a pair of maps that were far from accurate. But it was fun working on something together. Each day, when they reached the furthest point that they could, they would mark the extent of their expedition by ramming a stick into the soil. For a few days,
They made good progress. Each time they ventured out, they pushed a little further into the woods. Eventually, however, they came to a point where the brush grew prohibitively thick. With no clear path forward, the boys grew bored with the project and moved on to something new until they figured out how to navigate the wall of foliage blocking their way. As a replacement for their time in the woods, the boys devised a way to earn some money. They would open a snow cone stand. I won't rehash all the details from Balloons, but after Nathan's mother realized just how vulnerable her child was, her restrictions on Nathan's free time increased rapidly. She became much more watchful, and Nathan's time in the woods was strictly limited. She even went so far as to buy a watch for him and set alarms every half hour during the day. It was actually quite an expensive watch considering what she could afford, and Nathan treasured it. However, if Nathan didn't return home between each alarm, she threatened to take the watch away for good. In the end, the attempt to keep her son safe worked relatively well, but Nathan desired freedom above all else, and it was only a matter of time before he started to struggle against his mother's suffocating rules. Late into the year, Nathan and Josh rediscovered the maps that they'd been developing, and they started to brainstorm ways to surpass the brush that was halting their progress. It turned out that one of their greatest obstacles, the tributary that cut them off from a vast section of the forest, was also the solution to their problem. If they couldn't walk through the blockage in the woods, they would just have to go around it. They would build a raft. Securing the materials for such a vessel would be easy. Their neighborhood was old and undeveloped, which attracted all sorts of entrepreneurial types looking to stake their claim on the untouched lands. Several construction projects were popping up around the area, and it wasn't uncommon for them to just leave unwanted or discarded supplies just lying around. In fact, Josh's dad even worked on some of these projects. To the boys, that just meant that time was of the essence. The forest was changing, and they wanted to record their woods as they remembered them. Their design for the raft was crude, but effective. They took a few large pieces of styrofoam, lashed them together with rope and kite string, and used a pair of large branches to push the raft through the water. Shockingly, even when both boys climbed aboard, it stayed afloat. Their first few voyages didn't get them very far, however. Within the half hour that Nathan's mom gave them, they had to make it out to the spot in the woods where they kept the raft, get it into the water, sail as far downstream as they could, turn around, get the raft back on dry land, and return home. It was a pretty lengthy process to try to condense into 30 minutes. They took to storing the raft along with their shark float beside a particular tree at the furthest point from Nathan's house. Soon, their trips into the woods turned into a mad dash to their makeshift dock, followed by a desperate attempt to find new land beyond the obstructing tangle of woods. Despite numerous efforts, the time limit was just too prohibitive, and no opportunity to surpass their long-standing obstacle ever presented itself. It seemed that, despite their best efforts, they had been thwarted once more. After that, the summer heat abandoned them, and the weather became an effective deterrent to further voyages. It was just too cold to risk getting wet. There was no point braving the waters unless they had time to find a gap in the trees, but one evening deep into winter, a chance finally presented itself. It was a Saturday, and Josh was over for the night. It was barely beginning to get dark when one of Nathan's mom's co-workers knocked at the door. There was an issue at work, and they hadn't been able to reach his mom since their phone bill hadn't been paid that month. Stuck between a rock and a hard place, Nathan's mom commanded him to stay home, not to open the door for anyone, and not to get into anything while she went to deal with the situation. Then she closed the door, got in the car, and drove away. It was almost too perfect. The boys had trained themselves to make the round trip in just half an hour, but now they would have a couple of hours at the very least. Finally, they would get to finish their map. The only issue was the darkness that would be creeping after them through the woods. With no flashlights on hand, Nathan grabbed a few leftover Roman candles and a lighter from the 4th of July. They weren't a great source of light, but they planned to be back before it got too dark to see anyway. They also grabbed towels and a change of dry clothes for each of them, just in case. The boys eased out the back door, closing it up tight so that boxes wouldn't escape, before sprinting to the raft. When they arrived, they were disappointed to find that Mrs. Maggie's pool float was missing from their hiding spot. No doubt it had blown away, but thankfully, the raft remained. They stashed their clothes and towels by the tree and untethered the raft, being careful not to splash too much as they lowered it into the water. It wasn't so cold as to be dangerous, but it certainly wouldn't be pleasant to fall in. Unfortunately, they weren't able to avoid contact with the waters of the stream for long. Shortly after they passed the furthest point from their most successful expedition, the floor of the tributary rapidly receded, giving way to waters too deep for their sticks to push on. After that, Nathan and Josh had to resort to paddling with their bare hands. It was cold, slow work, and the splashing made it hard to hear anything in the woods surrounding them. I think that's why it took them a while to notice the crackling leaves and snapping branches that seemed to follow along behind them through the forest. When they finally became aware of the noises, they stopped to listen, trying to figure out whether they had imagined the sounds. They considered that it might be an animal, though they didn't know what kind. Frankly, whatever sort of animals were roaming their woods at night, they didn't want to meet them. With the splashing gone, the woods became eerily quiet. They paused momentarily to amend their map when another rush of snapping twigs and rustling leaves came. They hadn't imagined it.
Hello?
Hello?
So what?
Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods. I know you're sneaking around, but maybe you'll answer to my hello. Hello?
Nathan wasn't sure what reply he expected from the woods. It was probably just a raccoon anyway. But Josh's mockery broke the tension of the moment.
We continued mocking each other with increasingly elaborate salutations, while we dug our arms into the water and moved them in a counterclockwise direction so we could turn the raft back the way we had come. When the front of our raft had pivoted enough so that it faced the seemingly impenetrable woods, a sound floated out from them that chilled my blood so much that the winter water just below might have felt temperate. Hello. It was a breathy and airy whisper, the kind you might hear as someone read to himself, broadcasting his voice but not realizing it.
The boys were so startled by the reply that all they could do was look at each other in horror. The horror of not being so alone as you thought. Nathan looked back to where he thought the voice had come from and fumbled for one of the Roman candles. He wanted to see, despite Josh's protests. The fireworks lit the river in a vibrant green glow, but the light barely penetrated the wall of trees. Several more colors came, but none of them revealed the thing in the woods. With no clear view of the speaker, they decided it was best to turn around and return to their dock. As they started paddling away in retreat, however, they heard the sound of sprinting just past the trees. Whatever was out here with them was running straight towards their dock. They tried to paddle faster, but in their panic, they tore away one of the ropes binding the boat together. Nathan, Josh, and their map plummeted straight through the raft into the deep, cold water. The map immediately sank into the depths below, but Nathan and Josh frantically clung to chunks of styrofoam and splashed towards the embankment to escape the frigid stream. As soon as they did, the rustling overhead changed direction and started to approach them. They swam further down the shore and tried again, but footsteps rushed nearer every time they drew close to land. They simply had to swim all the way home. Thankfully, when they finally arrived back at their dock, the rustling seemed to have abandoned them. Unfortunately, something else was missing. Nathan changed into the shorts he had stashed near the tree, but his shirt was nowhere to be found. Assuming it had floated downstream somehow, he directed Josh to go home without him while he looked for the shirt. Someone needed to be there in case Nathan's mom showed up early. Nathan's search took him along the shoreline, up behind a row of houses. He looked along the water for anything that resembled a waterlogged shirt, when a voice behind him made him freeze.
I whipped around. It was Miss Maggie. In the porch light, she looked incredibly frail, and the usual warmth that wrapped her manner seemed to have been snuffed out by the chill. I couldn't remember ever seeing her without a smile, and so her face looked strange to me. Hi, Miss Maggie. Oh! Hi, Chris! The warmth and smile had returned to her, even if her memories had not. I couldn't see it was you in the dark there. What are you doing out so late? Just playing with a friend. Now that my rapid movements had stopped, the cold had started to creep into me again, and I could feel my teeth chatter against themselves. I was beginning to feel weak. Each breeze seemed to drive the icy water on my skin through it and down to my bones. Miss Maggie? I thought for a moment and collected myself. Miss Maggie, can I come inside? I just need a towel. My head began to swim. Not right now, Chris. Bother, how do I put this? She seemed to search for the words as I half-heartedly searched for my missing shirt and any scrap of paper that might be the map. She spoke out again at the same time I did, and her voice fell dully on my ear. Miss Maggie, have you seen Mom's home? I felt the world drop out from under me. Mom's home? Had she just said that? She was still talking, but I couldn't hear her anymore. I abandoned my search immediately and ran around the side of her house. I could hear Miss Maggie running through her house parallel to me. My legs felt weak, but I pushed them hard against her concrete driveway. My stomach twisted when I saw my mom's car on our driveway, but then I remembered that she hadn't taken her car. I thundered down towards the street and could hear Miss Maggie walking briskly across her frozen yard behind me, the ice-covered grass snapping and crunching beneath her feet. But I didn't look back.
A couple minutes later, Nathan stormed into his house. He'd been unable to find his missing shirt, but at the very least, his mom wasn't home yet. He threw on a warm shirt just moments before his mother walked through the front door, none the wiser. Quietly, he told Josh about his encounter with Miss Maggie. Of all the times he'd turned down her offers to come inside for snacks, the one time he had requested it, she had denied him. It didn't make sense what she'd said. Mom's home? But she wasn't. Whatever, that didn't matter. All that mattered was that Nathan and Josh had gotten away with it, though it could hardly be considered a success. The map was Nathan felt something in his back pocket. Slowly, carefully, he drew out a crisp piece of folded paper. The map? But he knew he'd watched it float away. Unfolding the piece of paper revealed not a scattering of blobs and lines meant to represent the woods, but a simple drawing of two stick figures holding hands. One much larger than the other. A pair of letters were scratched in next to the smaller figure. They were Nathan's initials. A few weeks later, a group of men wearing orange biohazard suits would remove dozens of black bags from Miss Maggie's house.
I didn't understand why Miss Maggie had left. I didn't understand what I was watching weeks later when I saw men in strange orange biohazard suits carry what I thought were black bags full of garbage out of her house, leaving the whole neighborhood blanketed in a faint but festering smell of decay. I still didn't understand when they condemned the house and boarded it up, but I understand now. Those men weren't carrying garbage in those bags. I'm as certain of that as I am of what Miss Maggie had really said that night, and who had really come home, regardless of what name she called him. That night, she told me, Tom's home.
The final conversation that Nathan shared with Miss Maggie is something that continued to haunt him well into his adult years. However, it's also an important piece of the puzzle. Without that memory, seared into Nathan's mind without understanding, he never would have been able to see the full picture in the present day. More than his time with Miss Maggie, however, I think the most important part of the story is that it's yet another glimpse at the friendship that Nathan shared with Josh. Unfortunately, it's one of the final times you'll see their friendship in this light ever again.
I had really only come to know her later in my life, but for those brief few weeks, I think I had really loved her.
This is undoubtedly the turning point in the story. The first two chapters, Footsteps and Balloons, both focused on ambiguous dangers that were impossible for a child to understand. In the midst of those horrors, Nathan was able to make friends, spend time with his family, and believed that his childhood was normal. Those times, he can still generally remember fondly, in boxes and maps, the danger he faced demanded recognition. From then on out, Nathan still drew closer to Josh and went on adventures, but there was no denying the fact that something was wrong. His memories were tainted by a background of terror. But here, in the final act of the story, nothing but pain remains, and every good memory is twisted into something unwanted. This chapter was undoubtedly the most heartbreaking on my first listen. It spans the widest range on the timeline so far, since it starts in Nathan's first grade class and jumps past balloons, maps, and boxes, all the way to Nathan's first year of high school. This chapter is also unique since, rather than focusing on Nathan, his mother, or Josh, it instead focuses primarily on Josh's older sister, Veronica. For as long as Nathan could remember, he knew that Veronica was beautiful. She was a couple years older than Nathan, and when he and Josh were still in kindergarten, she'd been so popular that a pair of third-grade boys had actually gotten in a fight over her. They argued over the significance of the messages which she had written in each of their yearbooks, which eventually led to one of the boys being struck with one of the books. Quite hard, too. He'd had to get stitches after that. Another boy who took a liking to Veronica was Nathan's friend, Alex, from the first grade. Alex was a boy to whom nature had been very kind. Despite only being in third grade, the boy was a monster, far larger than anyone else in his class, and a decent bit bigger than most of the older kids. He could have easily sat with anyone in the school, no one would have turned him away, but he chose to spend every lunch with Nathan. At the time, Nathan didn't have a single friend at school. He started the semester quarantined at his own table due to a sudden bout of pink eye, so he missed the critical window where kids pick their cliques. Nathan ended up excluded from all of them, and that made him an ideal target for bullying. At least, it would have if he didn't spend every lunch sitting next to the scariest kid in school. Even so, Alex hardly ever spoke a word to Nathan. When he finally worked up the nerve to ask Alex why he sat with him, the older boy bashfully admitted that he hoped Nathan would pass along news of his heroic efforts to Josh, and, therefore, Veronica. It was all one big attempt to impress a girl, but that hardly mattered to Nathan. He was just glad not to be picked on every day at lunch. And he got it, in a way. Even though he still found girls generally disgusting, he knew that Veronica was pretty, and that one day, she would be beautiful. He decided to honor his friend's request, and he told Josh about it. Josh was horrified that anyone would find his sister to be the least bit appealing, condemning her as a ugly crow, which I find to be a pretty hurtful comparison personally. Nonetheless, he agreed to pass it along to his sister since Nathan asked him to. For a long time after that, he hardly thought of Veronica. This all happened around the time when Nathan and Josh were trying to scout out the woods and complete their maps, so there were grander things on his mind. From there, Nathan's priorities changed quite a bit. He started to broaden his friend group quite a lot, to the point where he had several new friends that he hung out with each week. Now, he spent much less time in the woods and much more time with peers. Unfortunately, one thing that pushed Nathan to make new friends was the fact that his friendship with Josh had started to fall apart after the night they went to find boxes. It's not like they stopped being friends after that. In fact, there isn't really any explanation given for why the boys grew apart. Gradually, they just saw each other less and less, until finally, they stopped seeing each other altogether. Their friendship, once so important to them, had inexplicably been put on pause until further notice. Nathan had never really been great at making friends. His bond with Josh was more or less a result of their uncanny similarity and sheer coincidence. But shifting school structures led to another lucky coincidence. At the start of high school, Nathan's school got an influx of new students, and one turned out to be a familiar face from Nathan's past. It was Chris, the boy who, on the day of the balloon project all those years ago, had accidentally released his balloon earlier than everyone else. Their shared experiences made it easy for Nathan and Chris to hit it off. For the second time, Nathan fell into true friendship. Still hurting from the void Josh had left in his life, Nathan decided to make the most of the opportunity. Chris introduced Nathan to a couple other friends, Ryan and Adam, and the group bonded over a love for movies. One night, about a year later or so, The four of them were going out together to see a showing of Scanners by David Cronenberg at a local place affectionately referred to as the Dirt Theater. The main draw of this theater was most certainly not the quality of the screenings they showed. It was basically just a normal building with a projector set up inside, so everyone was seated on the same level, and you were lucky if you found a spot where you could actually see the entire screen. No, the theater's popularity was because of the fact that they regularly showed cult classics for just $1, and they served their drinks pretty, indiscriminately, if you catch my drift. That last fact made it pretty popular with the general high school crowd, but the first made it popular with Nathan. That night, he and his friends sat towards the very back of the room. The view was terrible, but Ryan had driven, so he had the final say. A few minutes before the movie started, a group of girls walked in. They were all fairly attractive, but their faces were blotted out of Nathan's memory entirely, overshadowed by one girl towards the front of the group. It was the girl with the dirty blonde hair. Hair just like her brother's. Nathan immediately recognized Veronica, though he was stunned by just how much she had surpassed his expectations. She was beautiful, and even though he felt like a bit of a creep, Nathan barely caught a glimpse of the movie. He was too distracted by the mix of emotions he was feeling. This ghost from his past was equal parts haunting and hope. He hadn't spoken to Josh in years, not since his 12th birthday party, where, even then, things felt off. That night, however, he decided that he would speak with Veronica, not about Josh, but about herself. He wanted to find out who she had become, and he hoped that she would be interested in him as well. Nathan's friends cleared out of the theater pretty quickly after the movie ended, but he stuck around, sick with anticipation.
Hey, Veronica?
Yeah?
It's me, Josh's old friend from way back. How have you been?
Oh my gosh, hey, it's been so long.
Yeah, a few years at least. Not since the last time I stayed over with Josh. How's he doing, anyway?
Oh, that's right. I remember you guys' games. Do you still play Ninja Turtles with your friends?
No, I'm not a kid anymore. Me and my friends play X-Men now.
You're cute. Do you come to these movies every time?
What did she say? Does she really think I'm cute? Did she just mean I'm funny? Does she think I'm attractive? Yeah, I try to, anyway. What about you?
I come every now and then. My boyfriend doesn't like these movies, but we just broke up, so I plan on coming more often.
Oh, well, that's cool. Not that you guys broke up. I just meant that you'd be able to come more often. So are you coming the week after next? They're supposed to show Day of the Dead. I think we've gotten to know each other pretty well in the last few minutes. I'm pretty positive you'd like the movie, especially if you went to the Saturday showing.
Well, in that case, I'll be there.
Nathan was about to suggest that they sit together at the showing when Veronica suddenly stepped forward and put her arms around him, pulling him into a hug.
It was really good to see you.
Nathan could hardly move, much less speak. If that moment had lasted forever, he would have been okay with that. Unfortunately, Ryan interrupted them by returning at that moment. The movie was over, and he wasn't about to miss an attempt to make things awkward for Nathan. Veronica pulled away, told Nathan that she would be back for Day of the Dead, and then she was gone. He wished he knew if she was coming back for the movie, or for him. After that, everything seemed to conspire against Nathan. He planned to ride to the theater with his friends just like he usually did, but Ryan was busy and no one else was old enough to drive. Nathan asked his mom if she would drop him off, a request which she, of course, denied. Even 8 years after their move, she was still so protective of him. It didn't make sense. She hadn't even known about the night when Nathan and Josh had went looking for boxes, so why? Nathan pushed back against the decision. He wasn't a kid anymore. She asked him why it was so important, and reluctantly, he confessed that he wanted to go because he had invited a girl. At that, his mother changed her tone, and it seemed like she might actually relent. She asked Nathan if it was someone she knew, mostly just to tease him. Unsure of how to respond, he decided to be honest, and he told her that it was Veronica. At that, the playfulness in her tone evaporated. After that, All Nathan got from her was cold denial, and he decided to drop it. Frustrated that his mother would be so controlling, Nathan determined that he would have to go behind her back. At first, he tried to call Veronica to see if she would be able to give him a ride. It was a bit embarrassing to ask her, especially since Nathan was considering this to be a date, but what other options did he have? He dialed the same number he'd always used to call Josh, hoping that Veronica would pick up instead. He felt guilty for not wanting to talk to his old friend, but in the end, it didn't matter either way. An entirely unfamiliar voice picked up, and it notified Nathan that he had a wrong number. It turned out that even if Nathan wanted to speak with Josh, he couldn't. At some point, Josh had moved, and Nathan was too out of the loop to find out. The guilt came on even stronger now because, for the first time ever, it didn't feel like his friendship with Josh was on pause. It felt like it was over. Trying not to remember his regrets, Nathan finally figured out a way for him to make his date with Veronica. On the night of the movie, he told his mother that he was planning to stay the night at Chris's house. That was true enough. Chris's house was only half a mile away from the Dirt Theater, which meant Nathan could easily evade Chris's parents, walk to the theater, and meet up with Veronica without anyone realizing he was gone. It was easy to convince Chris to go along with it, since he would be home chatting with a girl he'd met online anyway. Nathan left the house long after the sun had set. The walk from Chris's house to the theater was short, but dark. He had to walk along the side of the road to get there, which thankfully meant that he could rely on a steady rhythm of passing headlights to brighten his path. As he walked, he debated between different ways of greeting Veronica. Was it better to be waiting for her inside the theater, or was it better to come in after her? While he weighed his options, Nathan became aware of the fact that the rhythm of passing cars had given way to a more constant illumination. About 10 feet away, a car had stopped in the middle of the street. The headlights were blinding against the backdrop of night, making it impossible to see the car or its driver. Hoping that Chris's parents hadn't come home earlier to find their son's friend wandering down the road, Nathan squinted against the high beams, holding a hand up to shield his eyes. The car began to creep down the street once more, but when it passed, Nathan didn't recognize it. His eyes adjusted to the returning darkness too slowly to make out many details beyond the massive crack across the rear windshield, but Nathan assumed whoever it was must be lost. At worst, perhaps they were just trying to scare him. Nathan arrived at the theater a few minutes early and fought the urge to pace anxiously in front of the building. He was tormented by the possibility that Veronica might not even show up. I mean, who would actually go on a date with their little brother's ex-best friend? Just as he was starting to beat himself up for thinking she was seriously interested in him, he spotted Veronica walking across the parking lot. His heart raced. She was alone, and she was beautiful.
Are your friends already inside?
No, it's just me.
Oh, okay.
Nathan realized that probably made it seem too much like a date, but Veronica didn't seem to mind. He handed her a ticket for the movie, and she gave him an odd look. Realizing that made it seem even more like a date, he tried to break the tension with a joke.
Don't worry, I'm rich.
Veronica laughed, accepted the ticket, and the pair headed inside. Yet again, Nathan found it exceedingly difficult to focus on the movie. He spent most of the runtime debating whether or not to reach for popcorn at the same time as Veronica so their hands would touch, and another chunk of the runtime rushing outside to take a call from his mom someplace quiet. It was okay, though. He'd seen the movie already, and he was just happy to be there. Happy to be with her. It was nearly 2 a.m. when the movie ended, at which point drowsy workers ushered everyone out of the lobby and into the parking lot. The first thing that Nathan noticed outside the theater was a car with a large crack in the rear windshield, parked far from the entrance. Suddenly, the mystery surrounding his odd interaction with the car vanished. Clearly, the driver must have realized he was headed to the theater and decided to give him a scare. It was nothing more than one horror fan immersing another in a moment of real horror, which gave Nathan an idea. Most viewers cleared out quickly, but Nathan wasn't ready for the night to be over. While everyone else shuffled out to their cars, Nathan started in the direction of a local mall that had closed down a few years back. Thankfully, Veronica followed him, listening intently as he started to tell her the story of a robbery that had taken place there, just before it had gone out of business.
So, this mall closed like 5 years ago, but way back, this was the place where everyone would come to hang out and shop.
As opposed to all the other awesome places in this town?
Right. Anyway, everyone thinks this place just went out of business, but that's not true. What happened was that at some point, the manager or whoever noticed that a lot of the food inventory was going missing. I don't mean like candy bars, I'm talking about whole freezers full of food. So he put out all these security cameras everywhere, to try to catch who was taking it, but the cameras never showed anything. They'd be on all night, pointed at the freezers, but in the morning they'd open them up and all the food would be gone, and there'd be this huge mess.
Ooh, spooky.
Just hang on. So the owner guy hires these 2 security guards to stay overnight and keep an eye out. The first couple of nights, no problem, right? No food's missing, everything's cool. But one night, the guard hears this huge crash coming from across the empty mall. So he runs over to see what's going on. Then he hears these screams.
Okay.
It's his partner, but he can't tell where the screams are coming from exactly. On the video, it's just him running back and forth, and he's shouting something. But the cameras don't have sound, so nobody knows what he's saying.
How do you know all this then?
Just a second. So, eventually, the guard runs up to one of the freezers. The one behind the Chinese food place? Well, he opens it up, takes a look inside, and backs away. And then he just runs out of the mall. It didn't even lock the doors. Owner comes back in the morning, finds the mall unlocked and no sign of the security guards. He checks the tapes and he doesn't understand what happened, but he sees who left the door unlocked. After he checks the freezer and sees the mess and the missing food, he calls the police and sends them after the guard who just ran out. They find him at his house, just locked up in his room, shaking. They ask him what happened, but the guy won't talk. They ask him about the food, but the guy just keeps shaking. Finally, they take him into the station for more questioning. The police have a theory that these 2 guys were involved somehow, so they start really interrogating the guy. But he just won't talk. "Where's your partner?" they ask him. "What happened to your partner? Where did he take the food?" But the guy won't crack. Finally, they just start threatening him with jail time. He breaks down. The guy says he saw his partner being pulled through the big drain in the floor of the freezer. The police are like, pulled? Pulled by what? And the guy just starts crying and screams, "A monster." They do an investigation, but they never find the partner. But when they opened the grate on the floor of the freezer, they saw the pipe was gone, and it was just this big hole. The investigation shuts down the mall for a few months, and the owner goes bankrupt.
What about the guy, the security guard?
He winds up in the insane asylum down south. He draws these pictures of the monster during free time, but they always look different. But here's the thing. They never found any monster, but they did find all kinds of boxes and big plastic wrappers in that hole under the freezer. And they found the missing guard's flashlight down there too. It was smashed to pieces. The craziest part is that they just gave up. They just shut down the mall and locked it up forever. They say that if you're quiet and you look for long enough, you can still see the monster walking around the mall since no one's there to bother it. But what's weird is that everyone who's ever seen it tells a different story of what it looks like.
As he had recounted the story for her, Nathan had led Veronica up to a long row of windows along one side of the mall. As he finished, he approached the windows and peered inside, cupping his hands up to his face like he was holding an invisible pair of binoculars. He gestured to Veronica to do the same, and after a moment, she relented. The windows were so dirty that it was impossible to see anything, even pressed up against them like this. Thankfully, that wasn't the point. While Veronica tried her best to make sense of the vague shapes inside the mall, Nathan wound up his foot and delivered a solid kick to the window, causing it to shake violently. Veronica shrieked and clung to Nathan in response before she realized what had happened, and the 2 of them doubled over in laughter.
You jerk!
What? Didn't you see it? I'm sorry.
Veronica let go of Nathan's arm and playfully shoved him back. They continued to walk around the old mall for a while, talking about movies and eventually swapping cell phone numbers. Veronica told Nathan that his cell phone was the worst she'd ever seen, and Nathan agreed, explaining that his phone was far, far worse than it looked. It couldn't even receive picture messages. He tried to call Veronica as soon as she'd finished entering her number, and she promptly hung up on him.
Hey, I was going to leave you a voicemail. I had an important message for you.
Oh yeah? What was it?
Well, maybe I don't remember anymore. Should have just let it go to voicemail.
I messed up the settings on this thing. It never goes to voicemail, it just rings forever.
Veronica went into her call history and saved Nathan's number into her phone before they started making their way towards the Dirt Theater. Nathan nearly killed the mood by asking Veronica how Josh had been, but she simply told him that she didn't know. Rather than prying, Nathan just assumed that Josh must have fallen in with a bad crowd or taken a wrong turn somewhere in life. He asked her if Josh had ever told her about a boy named Alex in the 3rd grade, admitting that he knew it was a weird thing to ask. She confirmed that Josh had, but didn't elaborate on it. That was okay. If it was painful for Veronica to talk about her brother, Nathan would leave it at that. But Josh really had kept his promise all those years ago. He really was a good friend. That night had gone unimaginably well, far better than Nathan had expected or hoped, so he resolved to push his luck. They were totally alone in the parking lot now, and he was going to try to kiss Veronica. There was just one problem. Nature was calling, and he didn't want the urge to urinate rushing his first kiss. When they arrived at her car, Nathan apologized to Veronica before slinking off around the corner of the theater. He had to hop a fence to get out of her line of sight, but he would have felt weird going in front of her. As he clambered over the barrier, Veronica shouted after him, warning him not to stand on any grates lest the mall monster get him. Nathan discreetly crept through a chorus of crickets, searching for some place to relieve himself. The quiet chirping from the grass was all he could hear, until it was interrupted by one of the most memorable sounds of Nathan's life. A distant screech echoed through the night. The screech gave way to the tremendous rumbling of a car engine. A rumbling that grew louder and louder until a scream was cut off by a deafening, dull thud from the other side of the building. Nathan attempted to bolt around the theater, but he slipped on a stone, and his head struck the corner of a bench, hard. Another squeal of tires signaled the vehicle's retreat from the parking lot. Half a minute later, Nathan regained awareness and clumsily mantled back over the fence. There was no sign that anything had happened, but Veronica was nowhere to be seen. He rushed towards her car, slowing when he neared it. Broken glass was scattered across the asphalt, and the car had been forced out of place. Nathan didn't want to see the source of the sputtering, gurgling sound coming from the other side of the vehicle, but he inched his way around, and his heart broke. Veronica's twisted body lay in a heap on the pavement. Nathan couldn't tell if she was lying on her back, or if her neck had twisted around completely to gaze blankly at the sky. Her jaw hung open, the skin stretching too far on one side where the underlying bone had broken or pulled free from the socket. Bits of glass from the car's shattered windows bit into her skin, causing countless streams of blood to trickle down, staining her clothes. The little rivers pooled on the ground under her, joining the greater flow coming from where her foot had been nearly torn off. Her snapped shin bone jutting through the side of her leg and tearing through her jeans. One of her arms hooked up sharply just below the shoulder, wrapping around her neck, fingers twitching as if reflexively trying to hoist her jaw back into place. Nathan gaped at Veronica wordlessly, blood staining his shoes. He fell to his knees beside her, fumbling to call 911. When his malfunctioning phone failed him, Nathan gingerly slipped Veronica's phone from her pocket, thankful that it hadn't been crushed by the impact. As he freed the device, the tangled girl shuddered violently. Veronica's brain failed to conduct her crooked limbs in concert with one another, sending ripples through the pool of blood beneath her. She tried to sit up, but Nathan did his best to discourage her from struggling. He couldn't bear the noises her bones made with every spasm. Between gasps, she was trying to say something to Nathan.
He took it.
Soon, Nathan found himself in the waiting room of the hospital. Staff had rushed Veronica away as soon as the ambulance arrived, leaving Nathan alone, haunted by the memory of her disfigured form. Nathan was snapped out of his traumatized trance by the vibrations coming from his phone. Certain that his mother was calling to check on him, and entirely uncertain how to explain the situation to her, Nathan pulled out his phone. It was off. Overcome by the horror of understanding, Nathan reached into Veronica's purse. "Dad," said the text on her phone's screen as the incoming call caused it to buzz gently. He waited, hoping that the call would go to voicemail, before remembering what Veronica said. It would just keep ringing forever. Nathan hovered his finger over the end call button for a few moments before shamelessly pressing down on it. The vibration stopped, but guilt surged inside of him, and he began to cry. He got up from his seat and went to ask a nurse if it was all right for him to use the hospital phone to call his mother. He had no idea how to explain everything to her, but right now, he just didn't want to be alone. A few minutes after he spoke with his mother, the police entered the hospital and approached Nathan with a barrage of questions. With enough details, it was possible that they could find the culprit. All Nathan could tell them was that he thought the car was brown and that it had a crack in the rear windshield. The officer assured him that they would get the driver, but Nathan knew it was just a lie to console him. He hadn't remembered anything important, anything helpful, and that probably meant whoever attacked Veronica would get away with it. He couldn't shake the sense that all of this was his fault in some way. Nathan and his mother mostly sat in silence once she arrived. She was relieved that he was okay, but also furious that he had lied to her. He apologized, but she simply told him that they would talk about it later. I think that was the night that Nathan's relationship with his mother changed. That was when she realized that her son would never appreciate the sacrifices that she had made to protect him. And now he might have gotten the daughter of her closest friends killed. I imagine she was also angry with herself. As a single mom, Nathan's mother was used to shouldering others' burdens. For her, silence was a defense mechanism, a particularly destructive one. When the horrors stalking her and her son reared their ugly head, she kicked the can down the road. Every traumatic moment became a "we'll talk about this later." A little less protection and a few more honest conversations might have prevented a lot of pain, not just for her family, but for Josh's too. She called Veronica's parents and, realizing that her son wouldn't be leaving for some time, told him she would pick him up whenever he was ready. Nathan slipped Veronica's phone back into her purse, hoping to prevent her parents from putting together the pieces and realizing that he'd ignored their call. Hours later, hospital staff wheeled Veronica out to reunite with her family, only she had a cast covering most of her body and she was deep in chemically induced sleep. Going forward, Nathan visited Veronica every day after school. He felt so guilty over everything that had happened, but mostly he just wanted to see her, just wanted to talk to her. She couldn't respond for the first several days of her recovery. They had to wire her jaw shut, and she was rarely lucid enough to converse, but one day, when Nathan was about to leave, she managed to force out a few words through clenched teeth.
Josh.
Has he not come to see you?
No. Josh. He ran away. I should have told you.
When did this happen?
2 years ago. A little after his 13th birthday.
Images of the woods flashed in Nathan's mind. Images of the night that he'd run away, supposedly. So many of Nathan's memories seemed to converge at the clearing where he woke up in footsteps. The night he and Josh went looking for boxes, Nathan fell into a giant hole in that same clearing. When the boys secretly went out on their raft,
They'd lost the shark float Mrs. Maggie had given them, only for Nathan to find it in footsteps months later. That clearing had become the axis on which Nathan's life turned. That night, his mother found a note on his pillow saying Nathan never wanted to see her, Josh, or boxes ever again.
Why do you think he ran away?
The note on his pillow.
Even now, the memory of that night clung painfully to Nathan. Even now, he knew Josh hadn't run away. Even now, he wished he could tell Veronica the truth. But the truth was painful. And it was too late for the truth to do anything more than hurt. For the very first time, Nathan began to search for the complete picture within his broken memories. He wasn't ready to face the reality of what had happened yet. He wouldn't be for years. But he shared Veronica's pain nonetheless. She was already crying, and it was easy for Nathan to join her. He asked her if she would be okay once he left, and she assured him that she would be fine, since her mom was coming to visit her a bit later. Nathan retrieved Veronica's phone and set it within her reach, promising to text her. He kissed her on the head, and then he left. When he arrived home, Nathan demanded answers from his mother. She never told him that Josh had run away, but she claimed not to have known. Her friendship with Josh's parents had faded, just like Nathan's had with Josh, but she had told them about Veronica. She had their number, even though they had moved. She knew more than she let on, but getting answers from her was impossible. The rift between Nathan and his mother started to grow, and their relationship went cold. Nathan he needed answers that his mother couldn't give him, not without letting down barriers that she had constructed to protect herself and her son over the last decade. That couldn't happen all at once, and Nathan decided to drop it. The next day, he received a text. "Please don't come back here," Veronica told him. She didn't want to be seen again like that. So, broken in body and spirit. Nathan understood, sort of. He still wanted to see her, but he didn't want to make her uncomfortable. They talked every day after that. A few messages here and there. Nathan wrote long paragraphs to her, and she generally sent back short responses. He imagined that it was hard for her to type too much, so just once, he tried calling her. She picked up, but all Nathan ever heard from her side of the call was labored breathing. He tried talking with her for a bit, hoping to hear her voice, but eventually he had to hang up so that she wouldn't hear him crying. About a week after his last visit with her in the hospital, she texted him again out of nowhere.
I love you.
Nathan was stunned, and only one response felt appropriate.
I love you, too.
Weeks later, Veronica told him that she'd been released from the hospital and was recovering at home, but that he still couldn't see her yet. At that point, Nathan had become insistent about seeing her face-to-face once more. She promised that she would see him again soon, but never soon enough. Nathan missed her. Over her weeks in the hospital, their conversations had grown more and more intimate. Veronica frequently told him how badly she wanted to see him again, and of course, he felt the same. He felt closer to her than, well, anyone right now. When Chris's parents found out Nathan snuck out and about the situation with Veronica, it majorly derailed the dynamic of their friendship, as well as Nathan's bonds with the rest of the friend group. Boxes had been missing for years, Josh had run away, and his mother had gone completely cold towards him. Right now, Veronica meant everything to him. She was all he had left. He was ecstatic when she asked to meet at a showing at the Dirt Theater. Soon had finally come. He saved her a seat near the back of the theater so that she could easily get in and out. She claimed to be recovering well, but the picture of her tangled body hung in Nathan's mind. He wanted her to have plenty of space and not to push herself too much. 15 minutes into Akira, she still hadn't arrived. What was worse, around that time, a dirty-looking man walked into the theater and sat down beside Nathan in the seat meant for Veronica. He prompted the man to leave, explaining that the seat was taken, but the man ignored him. The anxiety of waiting on Veronica, combined with the man's wheezing, labored breathing, made the entire experience extremely uncomfortable for Nathan. Made worse still, when the credits rolled, Nathan was tortured by the fact that Veronica hadn't shown up at all. He begged her for an explanation, promising to understand, but after days of texting her with no reply, he finally got a message back. And that was the last one he ever got.
See you again soon.
Nathan became desperate enough to turn to his mother. He knew she wouldn't be happy that he'd gone behind her back again, but he didn't care anymore. He demanded the number for Josh's parents, but she seemed as deeply confused as Nathan felt.
What do you mean? I don't want to get into an argument with you over this, but she was supposed to meet me at the movies yesterday. I know there hasn't been much time since she got hit, but she said she would try to come, and after that, she just stopped talking to me altogether. She must hate me. If we wouldn't have gone to that movie, then she would still be okay right now. I don't know what to do. I just want to tell her that I'm sorry. That I'm sorry for everything.
Nathan started sobbing, and his mother's expression of confusion exchanged for a look of pure sorrow. She reached out and held her son close.
Veronica's dead, sweetheart. I thought you knew. What? What are you talking about? She said she was doing better. She said she was feeling better, Mom. What happened to Veronica? She's dead, sweetie. She died on the last day you visited her. Oh, honey, she died weeks ago. Then, why was her phone still on? Why did it take them so long to shut off her phone? The pictures. My mother told me that Veronica's parents thought her phone had been lost in the accident, despite the fact that I had put it in her purse the night she was brought to the hospital. When they retrieved her belongings, the phone was not among them, but they didn't deactivate the line. I asked my mom why this was, why they had failed to close her account, but she said that she didn't know. But I think I know. I think they just couldn't bear to do even one more thing that forced them to admit that she was gone. They probably would have kept that line active forever, but they received a call from their service provider informing them of a massive impending charge for hundreds of pictures that had been sent from her phone. Pictures. Pictures that were all sent to my phone. Pictures that I never got because my phone couldn't receive them. I learned that they were all sent after the night Veronica died. They deactivated the phone immediately. I tried not to think about the contents of those pictures, but I remember wondering for some reason that I couldn't place whether I would have been in any of them. My mouth went dry, and I felt the painful sting of despair as I thought of the last message I received from her phone.
See you again soon.
Nathan's story is coming to a close, and the pen pal is nearer than ever. There's still one more chapter to go, but this is your last chance to turn back. This is where the pieces come together. But some things are better left forgotten. If you want to continue, then join me back at the beginning. The ending will take care of itself.
The world is a cruel place, made crueler still by man.
Nathan's first day of kindergarten was rough. That morning, he cinched a bag around the cast on his arm, aimed at keeping the cast dry and secure while he showered. He'd done it plenty of times before, but he was so excited about his first day of school that he rushed himself rather than carefully sealing the bag. When he started to feel the water pooling at his fingertips, he realized his mistake and jumped out of the shower to amend it as quickly as he could. The smell was awful. The leak hydrated weeks' worth of dead skin within the cast, causing it to quite literally smell like death. His mom stuffed slivers of fragrant soap into the cask to mask the smell, but there was no denying the stench. All the hope and optimism that Nathan had felt about kindergarten drained from him. As his mother drove him to school and dropped him off, he felt foolish for calling the other kids his friends before he had even met them. He felt foolish for setting aside his clothes and Ninja Turtles lunchbox the night before, then making such a tremendous blunder the following morning. He felt foolish that his mistake had made them late, and most of all, he felt foolish because of the marker tucked into his pocket. He was sure no one wanted to sign his damp cast. More than all of that together, Nathan felt alone. Because he was late and joined his classmates during their second activity of the day, he had a hard time understanding what they were actually supposed to be doing. He jumped from group to group as each one complained about his performance, and the teacher moved him to keep the peace. He was surrounded by classmates, but that was the most alone Nathan ever felt at school. It was even worse than the first grade when he sat alone with Alex. That loneliness persisted into lunch as the kindergartners were ushered into the cafeteria. Nathan shambled to a table with his lunchbox, emptied its contents, and began to pick absently at his food before another boy came to mock his solitude.
I like your lunchbox.
It hurt Nathan's feelings that the boy would make the lunchbox the target of his ridicule, but he didn't know how to respond. He kept his eyes down, holding back tears until he realized the other boy's lunchbox also had Ninja Turtles on it. He hadn't been mocking him after all. The boys talked about which turtle was their favorite before Nathan finally worked up the nerve to remove the marker from his pocket.
Hey, want to sign my cast?
Sure, how'd you break it anyway?
I fell out of the tallest tree in my neighborhood.
Awesome.
The other boy scribbled a few rough letters across a large swath of the cast before recapping the marker and handing it back to Nathan.
Well, what does it say?
It's my name. Josh.
After that, Nathan and Josh were close companions. On days when Josh was absent from school, that familiar loneliness returned to Nathan. He got to know the other kids in his class, but there was something special about the connection he and Josh shared with one another. They helped each other, got in trouble together, and went on adventures together. Far, far too many times to remember. Nathan might have gotten to know other kids, but Josh was his only real friend. It was such a strong bond that after the balloon project officially took off and all the kids released their balloons to the wind, Nathan and Josh started to have sleepovers regularly. Josh became a constant fixture of Nathan's life, and it became a given that if Nathan had anything worth sharing, he would share it with Josh. They shared their plans, their time, and their burdens with one another. No matter what they were doing, as long as they were doing it together, the boys were happy. Nathan's move after the first grade was the first in a series of events that would eventually dry out their friendship. Even then, they made it work. They were in different schools, so they only saw each other on weekends, but that was enough. Nathan barely even needed to make new friends at school. Josh was his greatest ally, and there was no one else he wanted to share his adventures with. They stayed close and continued to grow together. Maybe Maybe if they had grown together a little less, and a little less willing to share each other's burdens, they never would have gone after boxes that night.
That night, perhaps because we were old enough to reflect on it appropriately, seemed to cause a rift between us. Not a striking and violent rift, but a gradual one, like two continents parting ways. The weekend after our excursion, I invited Josh over to my house, in keeping with our tradition of alternating houses, but he said that he wasn't really feeling up to it. If I'm honest, neither was I, and so I didn't protest. Maybe I should have.
The bond between them started to dissolve after that. Suddenly, for the first time since they'd met, their friendship didn't feel worth the effort anymore. It was hard to find new adventures to go on, new depths to brave together. Maybe it was because the depths they'd already braved had turned out too dark time and time again. Maybe they were afraid of what their next adventure might hold. For Nathan's 12th birthday, his mother planned him a party. He hardly knew anyone. It was difficult to put together a small list of acquaintances for his mother to invite. But there was really only one person he wanted to come. He called to invite Josh himself, promising that there would be games and a magician, but his friend sat on the other end of the line in silence. Worried he'd done a poor job of selling the party, Nathan told Josh that they didn't have to do any of those things if he wasn't interested. But Josh declined outright. He didn't feel up to a party, no matter the specifics. Nathan's enthusiasm for the party vanished. He didn't really feel up to a party either, at least not without Josh. The day before the party, Josh inexplicably called up again to say that he'd changed his mind. Nathan's enthusiasm was immediately restored, but when the party began, something still felt off. Josh was quieter than he'd ever been. He hadn't brought a gift, and it was like he didn't know how to carry a conversation with Nathan anymore. It had been months since they'd seen each other, and there was a growing sense that that was by design rather than circumstance. Nathan wanted to confront Josh about their atrophying friendship, but before they could resolve anything, Nathan's mother gathered everyone together for gifts. Most of the gifts weren't particularly memorable. Celebrating was the furthest thing from Nathan's mind, but one of the cards stood out for being a bit particular. The plain white envelope didn't have Nathan's name written on it, but it had been inserted into a pile with the rest of them, so he assumed it was for him. The card was simple, if a bit discolored. On the front was an image of a set of birthday balloons, and inside it was only a single pre-printed message. I love you. He thanked his mother for the card, but when she denied giving it to him, she teased him, saying, "At least you know two people who love you." Everyone laughed, but I struggle to see the humor in it, considering I think it's pretty clear where the card came from, considering the balloons on the cover. The next gift to come out was a curse in disguise, a new pair of walkie-talkies. Nathan's mom must have hoped that it would reunite the boys, unaware that the radios would serve as a grim reminder of the night that had driven them apart. As soon as they were unwrapped, Nathan's stomach dropped, and he looked across the room to Josh. A few minutes later, Josh was on the phone with his father, asking to be picked up. He explained that he was feeling sick and promised to call Nathan more often in the future, a promise that would inevitably be broken. Sensing his friend's disappointment, Josh had an idea. He had finally figured out what to get Nathan for his birthday, and guaranteed that while it would take a while, it would be perfect. Soon, there was a knock at the door. Veronica and Josh's dad had arrived to pick him up. At the door, he apologized to Nathan one last time for being so distant over the last few months and for being so quiet at the party. He said that he was tired and that he hadn't been sleeping well. But when Nathan asked why that was, Josh walked a few steps away before turning back to face Nathan for the last time.
I think I've been sleepwalking.
And that's the final childhood memory in Pen Pal. The chapter continues by stating that As the now fully grown Nathan has pieced together his lost memories through conversations with his mother, their relationship has become intensely strained. Silence was a defense mechanism for Nathan's mother. But for Nathan to understand his memories, he needed her to drop those defenses entirely. He needed her to be honest with him. He needed the truth, but it was too late. It was too late for the truth to do anything more than hurt. The final passage of this story comes from Nathan's final conversation with his mother. It's a collection of memories from different people. Josh's father, Nathan's mother, and finally, Nathan himself. These memories don't fill every gap, don't answer every question, but they do enough. After they found his running away note, Josh's parents looked everywhere for him. They called everyone they knew, exhausted every lead, turned every stone, and nothing. They used every resource at their disposal. Family members, friends, the police, missing children networks, each one a dead end. Wherever Josh was hiding, whoever he was with, he was just out of reach. The best lead they ever got was from an anonymous caller. A woman had contacted the police several times, practically begging them to compare the case with a stalking case from about 6 years prior, around when the unstamped picture of Nathan and Josh showed up at Nathan's house. Unfortunately, the lead was written off. For months after the disappearance, Josh's father occasionally picked up the phone for callers offering fake tips, criticism, or just plain mockery. To some, the tragedy of Josh's disappearance was a joke. Others saw it as negligence, and a few took it as an opportunity to be cruel without consequence. Josh's father could handle the scorn. The reality of losing his son, that was unbearable, but people's opinions meant nothing. Josh's mother, however, the loss of her son fractured everything she was, and years later, Veronica's death shattered her completely. She lost touch with reality entirely after that, and Josh's dad had to do his best to care for and protect the one person he had left in the world. He tried to be with her as much as possible, but they also needed money. Bad. Fortunately, someone enterprising had finally seen the monetary value of the woods connecting Josh and Nathan's houses. There were plenty of jobs available for anyone looking to do some manual labor. The forest was destroyed. The trees chopped down, stumps torn up, and the lot flattened out, erased. That last job was taken on entirely by Josh's dad. It was a good opportunity to make some extra cash close to home. A few days into the job, he ran into complications in a particular section of the lot. One of the depressions in the soil refused to level out, no matter how many times Josh's father attempted to compact it. He considered just packing more dirt over it as a band-aid fix. I mean, he'd get paid the same either way, but cutting corners always gnawed at him, and he knew it would cause issues for someone down the line. Besides, that someone might be him if he was lucky enough to work that site in the future. So, out came the shovel, and he began to empty out the pit once more. Whatever was causing the instability would have to be removed and replaced before the job could continue. And once the shovel collided with something hard and hollow, Josh's father knew he'd found... What had he found? He expected to find decaying tree roots or some similar obstruction, but this... He jammed the shovel back down to gauge the material by sound, and the buried thing cracked open as the blade of the shovel plunged through. Increasingly perplexed, Josh's father continued digging to uncover the object. Inside the hole was a sizable crate, covered in a layer of cloth stained brown by the soil. Shortly after, Josh's father placed a call. A short time later, Nathan's mother arrived to find her friend sitting perfectly still with his back to the hole. "I don't understand," he muttered to himself, over and over again. As his mother described the scene to Nathan, he started to tremble. His stomach turned, but he continued to dig. He needed the truth. He asked her where exactly the hole had been, already knowing the answer. It was in the clearing where he woke up in the woods, the site of the first accursed memory that had started this whole investigation, the through line of all his trauma, the hole he had fallen into when he and Josh went looking for boxes. It had never been a hole at all. It had been a grave. Nathan tried to stop her from going on. She had resolved herself never to share this story with him, and only now did he understand why. Now, she had finally cracked. Nathan had gotten her to let down her defenses, and everything she had been holding back, everything that she had been carrying alone for years, decades of fear, grief, and trauma, came rushing out. Nathan had taken his mother step by step through every painful memory from his childhood, and now his mother was revisiting a memory of her own, a memory better left forgotten. As Nathan's mother peered into the grave, Josh's emaciated face stared back in supreme anguish. There was no telling how long he'd been dead. The smell rising from the grave was overpowering, but the blood and bile smeared across his cracked skin looked somewhat fresh. If more time had passed, maybe his look of terror would have rotted away. It would have been better that way, Nathan's mother thought, as those accusatory eyes bored into her. On top of Josh, there was another body in the grave, much larger than his own. The man's arms were locked around the young corpse in a final embrace, his stained fingers woven into Josh's dark hair, holding him close. The side of the man's face, pushed up close to Josh's own, was caked with blood which flowed down, mingling with the dirt as crimson mud under the pair. She couldn't understand why Josh's father had called her. They hadn't spoken since the night of Veronica's accident, but her confusion morphed into something darker when she saw the item pinned to Josh's shirt. It was a Polaroid, a picture of Nathan. The weight of every secret she had kept crushed her, her knees buckling. The footsteps, the Polaroids, the pen pal. She'd shouldered it all herself, never sharing it with anyone. And it had caused this. Josh's parents hadn't known about the night Nathan ran away, or the photograph of Nathan and Josh in the ditch, or that those things had scared her so bad she moved across town. They never knew about the police involvement. They never knew Nathan was in danger, and they never knew that danger extended to their children. They never knew the truth. And now, it was too late for the truth to do anything but hurt. The monster who had terrorized Nathan and everyone around him was no monster at all, but a man. And now that man was dead. The story was over. Now they were all left to live in the long, dark, and painful denouement.
I can't tell my wife. I can't tell her that our little boy, she couldn't bear it.
Josh's father jumped into the grave alongside the two tangled bodies, grabbing the larger by the shirt collar and tearing him away from Josh. The body lifted halfway before his shirt ripped, and the rigid weight fell back down on the boy. Stale air was forced from Josh's still lungs. His father screamed and hefted the man against the wall of the pit, propping him up on dead, stiffened legs. With one last push, he ejected the man from the grave entirely, but a bottle clattered back into the casket. Josh's father retrieved it and tossed it to Nathan's mother before returning his attention to his son. Nathan's mother's eyes shifted from the expression on Josh's face to the one on the pen pals. It wasn't fair. The despair marking Josh's face was contrasted by the smile cracking the face of the pen pal. Not a wicked grin, but a look of satisfaction, contentedness, love. Below his blissful expression, a large chunk of flesh had been ripped out of his neck, completely soaking the collar of his shirt in blood. She struggled to comprehend what had happened, and her mind searched for an explanation. She looked at the bottle in her hand. Ether, read the label. Her eyes flitted down to the scraps of wood that formed the lid of the coffin. On the underside of the boards, on what would have been the inside of the box, a handle was screwed into the wood. Hideous understanding overcame her as she put the pieces of the puzzle together. They were alive, she whispered, too quietly for Josh's dad to hear. This horrible man had put Josh to sleep and stored him in that box before making preparations to join him for eternity. Only he hadn't used enough ether. Josh's death hadn't come quickly. He reawoke in subterranean darkness, pressed against the greatest evil he had ever known. All he knew to do was fight. He bit into the pen pal's neck and bled him dry, but he couldn't fight hard enough. The weight was too much. Josh never knew freedom again. Tears poured down Nathan's mother's face. She searched the man for identification, but all she found was a simple drawing. 2 stick figures, one taller, one shorter, with a set of initials next to the smaller figure. Nathan's initials. Josh's father freed his son's body from the grave, but he looked wrong. His father kept muttering about his hair being different. Rather than being dirty blonde like Veronica's, Josh's hair had been dyed. Now, it hung in dark brown curls, just like Nathan's. His clothes were much too small for him, and I would hazard a guess that his shirt, though stained and caked with dirt and blood, was decorated with an image of an iguana by the beach. In his shorts, Josh's father found a scrap of paper along with a key. You may already have a good idea of what the paper was, and as he listened to his mother's story, Nathan did too, though he desperately wanted to be wrong. He asked her what was on the paper, and while she didn't understand the significance of it, she recognized what it probably was. A map. I felt my heart shatter. Josh was finishing the map. That must have been his idea for my birthday present. He had resumed the expedition on his own. That was our first great adventure, and he had decided to finish it. For me. For us. Tears began streaming out of my eyes as I learned this, and I found myself desperately hoping that he hadn't been taken while working on it. Despite everything that had happened, he had kept the map in his pocket for almost 3 years. Looking at the face of the man who'd killed his son, Josh's father couldn't help but blame himself. He'd met the pen pal nearly a month back, at which time the man offered to pay him $100 to fill in a few holes on his property. I don't know if the pen pal truly owned any of the land. I doubt he did, considering this dude once spent years living in somebody's crawl space. But the end result was the same, either way. He tricked Josh's father into burying his own son alive. And in his mind, that meant that his son's blood was on his hands. He carefully walked around Josh's body before kicking the pen pal's corpse back into the grave, retrieving a jug of gasoline from his truck, and instructing Nathan's mother to leave. It was some small consolation that he had stolen eternity with Josh from the monster in the pit. But of course, the pen pal would never know that. He would burn for what he had done. but it would be with a smile on his face. His victory had been final enough. The story left Nathan empty. There's nothing else to say. No more secrets left to spill. So Nathan stood, told his mother he loved her, and promised he would see her again soon. On his drive home, he kept thinking about the riddle. How far can you go into the woods? It reminded him of the night he and Josh had discussed it in the woods. Now, a new riddle tormented him. Why Josh? Why, after years of following Nathan, had he gone after Josh instead? Why didn't he kill Nathan that first night in the woods? Why stay so close for years and then vanish? He had taken everything from Nathan. Boxes, Veronica, Josh, and even his mother in some sense. And then he had abandoned him. Why? There was only one man who knew. And now he had taken one last thing from Nathan. Answers. In this, there would be no closure, but there was completeness. Vile, abominable completeness. I had watched the pieces all fall into place, but I still couldn't understand why it had all stopped so long ago, why it had all simply ended. Sitting in my car that night, I saw it all clearly for the first time. As an adult, I could see the connections that were lost on a child who tends to see the world in snapshots rather than as a sequence. The picture was complete, but I wished I had never seen it at all. I left the gas station and drove the rest of the way home and thought, which is all that's left for me to do anymore. I think about Josh's parents, how much they had lost and how quickly that loss had come. They were good people, kind people. They don't know about my connection to any of this, but I could never look them in the eyes now. We still live in the same town, and I worry every day that I'll run into them somewhere. I find myself hoping that I don't see them, and I feel sick when I have that thought. I think about Veronica. I had only really come to know her later in my life, but for those brief few weeks, I think I had really loved her. I think about my mother. She had tried so hard to protect me. She had done everything she could possibly do to keep me safe. She was stronger than I will ever be. I think about what our lives might be like now if I had just let my balloon go with Chris's, or even a single second sooner or later than I did. Maybe someone else would have found it, and everyone would be okay. Maybe I'd still have my friend, and his parents would still have a son. But mostly I just think about Josh. I loved him then, and I love him even still. Sometimes I wish that he never sat across from me that day in kindergarten. That I'd never known what it was like to have a real friend. Sometimes I like to dream that he's in a better place now. But that's just a dream, and I know that. The world is a cruel place, made crueler still by man. There would be no justice for my friend. No final confrontation, no vengeance. It's been over for almost a decade now, for everyone but me. I miss you, Josh. I'm sorry that you chose me, but I'll always cherish my memories of you.
We were explorers. We were adventurers. We were friends.
The last line of Pen Pal always hits me like a truck. This analysis is going to be a bit different than most that I've done. As usual, I retold the story with a focus on the elements I find to be most thematically important, and I've tried my best to analyze as we go, so this section isn't massive. However, condensing 10 years of thoughts about my favorite horror story into one elegantly wrapped interpretation is beyond me, so I'm going to offer you 3, each one centered around a fundamental part of what makes Pen Pal, Pen Pal. Josh's death is the result of a chain of dark miracles. The wrong thing happening at the wrong time, every time. The slightest change to the earliest events of the story would have prevented this disastrous ending, but every mistake, every secret, every lie, every slip led Josh to that box. The earliest memory shared with us shows Nathan in his element, free to explore. It's the passage from boxes where Nathan describes learning to climb the tallest tree in his neighborhood. As is so often the case, the desire to climb trees is paired with the reality of falling out of them. And that leads to broken bones. Nathan's fall from the tree was avoidable. He just got too confident and stepped off a branch before he had hold of the next. But that very simple mistake sent him to the ground, to the hospital, and then back home to recover alone. At least, it did until Nathan's mother came home with a kitten. Nathan's very first friend. After boxes arrived, Nathan's recovery was a lot more fun. They were alike in many ways. Both loved freedom, and neither could stand to be trapped inside. All was right when they were outside, exploring the world around them. Later, once Nathan started kindergarten and met Josh, the duo of freedom-loving adventurers became a trio. Nathan's fall from the tree, however, had a cascading effect on his life. His tumble out of the tree would also send him and Josh through the night woods on a search for boxes years later. If Nathan had never fallen from the tree, never broken his arm, his mother wouldn't have felt the need to console him. She never would have gotten boxes, and boxes never would have escaped that night. If Nathan and Josh hadn't returned to the house in search of the cat, the Pen Pal likely never would have found Nathan again, and he never would have set his sights on Josh. All that because of one little slip up in a tree. Of course, that isn't the only tragic coincidence in this story. As Nathan's first year of kindergarten went on, the balloon project gradually rose to the forefront of his mind. When the day finally rolled around, Nathan wanted it to go so right, and he spent a great deal of time preparing for it. At least, it was a lot of time for a 5-year-old. Maybe that's why, when Chris let his balloon go earlier than the rest of the class, Nathan had the presence of mind to hang on to his just a few seconds longer. Undoubtedly, the greatest coincidence out of the entire story is that Nathan's balloon ended up in the hands of some creep rather than a normal, well-adjusted adult like everyone else in his class. The wind made no mistake in carrying the balloon where it did. That was entirely a matter of chance. No, the mistakes were made at the hands of the adults in charge of the project. It's hard to predict the outcomes of our choices, and no one saw this tragedy coming. But they should have. The existence of the balloon project is a tragic coincidence in and of itself. Too many people signed off on the idea of putting children in direct contact with strangers when one skeptic could have alerted everyone to the danger. It seems so obvious in retrospect, and it's astounding that no one put a stop to the project considering the massive fuss made regarding stranger danger over the years. Nonetheless, Nathan and the rest of the children were just excited to receive their letters, and it kept them happy and engaged in class. And that was enough. After Josh's death, Nathan, his mother, and Josh's dad all shoulder a degree of guilt for what happened. But should they? Josh's father blames himself because he was the one who buried Josh. But really, he didn't know any better. Of everyone in this story, I think I may hold this man the least contemptible. He literally did nothing wrong. If only he knew the truth. Maybe he would feel differently. Maybe he would be able to see himself as blameless in his son's death. Or maybe it would just hurt worse. Nathan blames himself for getting Josh involved in his life. Throughout the story, Nathan repeatedly breaks the rules and accidentally drags Josh into the sights of the pen pal, but honestly, I don't hold that against him. He just wanted to explore with Josh in boxes, and all of his actions were taken in pursuit of friendship and freedom. In the end, Josh and boxes were both trapped so that Nathan could go free. The exchange was made in pain and terror, but at the end of it all, Nathan is free, and I like to think that means Josh won. Nathan may be wandering in the woods right now, lost in the pain and confusion of grief. But you can only walk so far into the woods before you begin walking out of them. Finally, there's Nathan's mother, who I think genuinely has a degree of guilt in all of this. Josh's father didn't know any better and never could have avoided his son's death. If he hadn't buried Josh, someone else would have. Nathan could have obeyed more rules and lived a safer life, but not without losing the freedom that made him who he was. His mother, on the other hand, could likely have changed the course of this story just by having a few hard conversations. Now, look, I'm not saying that this wasn't an enormously difficult situation to navigate or that I would have done any better. What I am saying is that Nathan's mother is the only character who had a nearly complete picture from the beginning and chose to keep it to herself. There are times when she tries to help, such as when she calls in an anonymous tip after Josh goes missing, but it's always too little. She keeps secrets when she knows the truth might avert disaster, all because she's afraid to confront reality. If that anonymous tip had instead been personally delivered to Josh's parents along with an explanation of Nathan's past, maybe they could have searched the woods. Maybe they could have searched Nathan's old house, and maybe they would have actually found Josh. Or better yet, if she'd been open with Josh's family from the start, maybe he never would have gone missing to begin with. Maybe she did her best, but maybe her best wasn't good enough. Maybe that's too harsh. She's a victim in this too. I know the pen pal is the only true evil in this story, but Nathan's mom had so many years to change, to let her barriers down and do the right thing. She had chance after chance to help, but instead she only grew more reclusive, pushing others away when really she needed help too. I don't know. I never ask for comments, but I genuinely want to know your thoughts on this. Do you think that any responsibility falls on Nathan or his mother? In any case, this is what I mean when I say that Pen Pal is a series of tragic coincidences. From the very beginning, every character is unwittingly condemning themselves through seemingly innocent decisions, digging a hole that, by the time they realize they're in it, is already too deep to climb out of. As you may know, a few months ago, I made a video where I spoke with tons of horror creators from around the internet, one of which being 1000 Vultures, the author of Pen Pal. In my interview with him, he said that, at its core, Pen Pal is a love story. Makes perfect sense, right? That is, if you look past all the suffering, twisted corpses, and general depression. Yeah, honestly, on a first read, I can't imagine that anyone would leave this story and think it's about love. Now, I could probably just ask Dathan to explain what he meant when he said that, but that would be super lame and would kind of defeat the purpose of this whole video. So instead, I'm going to tell you what I think he meant by that. Pen Pal is ultimately a story about Nathan and Josh. It's about the love of one friend for another. But it's also a story about the love of a parent and the love for a pet and romantic love. In every chapter, Pen Pal devotes the majority of its length to exploring the myriad of bonds that Nathan shared throughout his childhood. Sure, there's horror along the way, and the destination is undeniably harrowing, but the bulk of each chapter focuses on what was most memorable to Nathan, the people he loved, and not the horrors he forgot. The first love it focuses on is between Nathan and his mother. By the end of the story, their relationship has been battered and changed dramatically, but the bond is still there. Nathan's mom, despite her flaws, did everything she could to keep her son safe. Over the years, she stayed strong and protected Nathan, even when he seemed determined to dive into danger time and again. The night Nathan ran away, she grappled with the fear that she might never see him again. When he showed up on the doorstep late into the night, she grabbed onto him as tightly as she could. "I've got you," she said to comfort him. And while she may have loosened her grip in the moment, she never let go of her son again. It wasn't her fault that Nathan could never live like that. From her perspective, there was no other way to live, only death. Fear transformed her love into something suffocating. But maybe that was necessary. The second love is between Nathan and Boxes, his first friend. Even though Boxes was a cat, I think it's fair to say that he was the truest friend Nathan ever had besides Josh, and maybe Veronica. There was a special kind of kinship between them that drove Nathan to go looking for Boxes when he went missing, braving some of the worst things he could imagine. Also, his pet could be safe. I've got a couple of cats of my own now, and I'll be honest, that entire chapter hits so much harder when I'm picturing one of my little guys. It's heartbreaking that Nathan was robbed of Boxes for no good reason. But the lengths of Nathan's efforts to save his friend prove how deep his love was. Then, there's love as it's meant in screens. Nathan never got much time with Veronica, but they met at a time when he had very little. Chris and his other friends were great, but they couldn't fill the void that Josh left. Not even Veronica could. But she didn't need to fill that void to be important. She meant something different to Nathan than Josh had. Life without Josh was unimaginable in Nathan's younger years, but a life with Veronica, well, that was equally fantastic. She represented the possibility of adventure after Nathan had lost his friends, his freedom, and his childhood. She was pure potential. Freedom given form. Not only that, but she was also a true friend to him. She was fun, genuine, and easy to talk to. She never looked down on Nathan, and she gave him a fair shot, even though he was her younger brother's friend. From her point of view, Nathan represented a happier time. Before Josh had run away, when everything had been okay, Nathan couldn't bring her brother back, but he made her feel like things could be okay again. Even if she was wrong. Even if things never went back to being okay. Their romance was real. Their love was real. And it was malignant, obscene, unacceptable. That's why the pen pal had to destroy it. Because Nathan was only allowed to love him. In this story, even the horrors are derived from love, the twisted, mutant form of it. Every evil act, all the way back to the very first chapter, is an act of love. An attempt at intimacy between the monster masquerading as a man and the boy. Never to be unless bonded in death. Unable to be united with Nathan, he looked to another. Just as Miss Maggie looked at Josh and saw her son John, so too did the pen pal look at Josh and see Nathan. His mind saw what it wanted to see, and when it didn't, the pen pal helped the delusion along by dyeing Josh's hair and dressing him up in Nathan's clothes. If he couldn't have Nathan, he would make Josh into a mockery of him to love instead. That's the sort of love it was. Destructive, as near to hate as affection, and as disastrous for the lover as the loved. In the end, such a love was too much for the pen pal to live with. However, in this story, the love between friends surpasses them all. Nathan and Josh had something special, something that transcended all standards for companionship. From the first day they met, it's like it was meant to be. Out of all the painful coincidences in this story, one happy one is that both boys brought the same lunchbox to their first day of school, and that made it easy for them to talk. It was easy for them to talk, so it was easy for Nathan to ask him to sign his cast. Then, it was easy for Nathan to remember his name. Josh. His first real friend. His best friend. For someone whose life had been characterized by loss, Nathan's life has been equally defined by love. In the end, that was the gift that Josh gave him. Joy amidst pain. Josh was the only friend Nathan ever truly loved, and nothing would make him forget that. The main character of this story is not named Nathan. They don't even really have a name, and they probably aren't even real, but when you read Pen Pal, something becomes very obvious. Somebody's life really is documented within these pages. Now, I'm not saying that Nathan Auerbach really spent his childhood avoiding a stalker who eventually killed his best friend. But what I am saying is that very little of this book has been invented. Altered, sure. Exaggerated, probably. But invented? Certainly not. Instead, it's clear that the vast majority of Pen Pal is drawing on real experiences, and that makes it feel uniquely personal and relatable. The entire story is saturated with details that are simply too specific for someone to have just thought them up. When Nathan talks about receiving a Mighty Max toy shaped like a snake on his 12th birthday, I'd be pretty surprised to learn that Nathan doesn't picture a specific toy from his childhood. Likewise, I assume that the unique brand of shadiness characterizing the Dirt Theater is drawing on a real place in Dathan's hometown, and I'd even bet that Dathan's childhood home featured a similar sense of impermanence as the one in the story. Pen Pal, above all internet horror, is supremely believable. If not in the drama, in the details. That's because in a story all about memories, most of the memories are real. The first time I listened to Pen Pal, I was alone. As I mentioned earlier, I had lost contact with a good friend several months before, and I turned to the internet as a source of entertainment and connection. Horror piqued my interest, and Pen Pal catalyzed my interest into an obsession. I was equally disturbed, depressed, and dazzled by the writing, and you can tell that in all of my earliest writing attempts. I also immediately knew that I had to share this story with my best friend at the time. Speaking of, he's a stellar artist, so you should absolutely go check him out. That second listen, I was even more impressed by Pen Pal, even though I knew where it was all leading. Perhaps even more importantly, my friend loved it too, and it became something that he and I could bond over. That made me realize that I needed to share this story with more people. Now, I haven't talked about this much on the channel, but my mom is pretty awesome. Growing up, we always watched TV shows like The X-Files, The Twilight Zone, and Supernatural together. I even got her to watch most of Death Note with me at one point. So, of course, I had to share Pen Pal with her as well. I still remember riding around in the car with her as we listened to it on my phone. The fourth time I listened to Pen Pal was with Mrs. Crow, back when we were still dating. At the time, horror was something that I enjoyed, but she had never really been into. She was curious though, so naturally I figured, hey, why not just go ahead and traumatize her? I guess that approach worked because she continued to want to explore the genre with me, and horror is one of the main things we've bonded over in our relationship. The fifth time that I experienced Pen Pal was, well, it was for this video. Although technically I've probably gone through it like 4 or 5 more times just for the video alone. This time, I went through it alone again. It seemed fitting, considering that follows the pattern of the story as well. It starts off with Nathan, alone in the woods, before focusing in on his relationship with Josh, his mother, and Veronica. Likewise, I've also connected with a friend, my mother, and even now my spouse over this story. I guess all that I have left is to read it to my cats. But finally, at the end of it all, the story concludes with Nathan alone once more. Only, he wasn't alone at that point. At that point, Nathan had shared his life story with thousands of people online. He'd told them about the love he felt for his mother, for Veronica, for Josh. And now, I've gotten to share this story with you, too. More than that, I've gotten to share my memories of this story with you. I'm so appreciative for what this story is, for all the subtle ways that it has shaped me and my relationships. So, to Dathan, I just want to say, thank you for writing a story that is, to me, unforgettable. I'm Cromudgeon. See you again soon.
Really quick, I just want to give a final thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel, and I want to give another huge thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to use my link in the description to go check them out.